Hey, my name's Joel Duff, and we're back with Answering Student Questions Part 2. So in Part 1, I explained that these are real questions from college students from one of my classes, and I spent a long time going over the first half of these questions. So long I decided I need to split this into two parts. So Part 2, we've got kind of I'll say the more difficult questions coming up. We've got a number of students who have questions about religion and evolutionary theory. Hey, does evolutionary theory even matter at all? A little bit about the origin of life, questions about life on other planets. Those are the primary questions that have come up. Just as a reminder, I am recording these for my students. This is a college class, and so I am going to go into some, in some cases, the questions I will probably not go into a lot of detail about. In other questions, I might go into, a lot of boring details, compared to what a YouTube audience might be expecting. All right. I understand that they're part of a course they're taking, and I am trying to help them understand concepts, and I'm also giving them, I'm going to be referencing like things they're going to be learning in the class in the future, how it relates to things that we've been talking about in class. So those things are just understand that my responses to these questions are very much in the tone of these are college students, and here's how I would try to answer their questions from the perspective of I am an educator who is trying to help them, understand evolutionary biology better from this scientific perspective, from a perspective of there are biology students who need to understand something about the basic principles of evolutionary biology. Most of these students are pre-med students, so they're on their way to hopefully becoming doctors of some sort. And this class is a prerequisite. They must take this particular class. And many students sometimes don't see the relevance of a basic evolutionary biology class to like their career. But I'd hope that by the end of the class they start to see that. We talk a lot about evolutionary medicine. We're going to talk about viruses, and we really are focused on like how do organisms, including parasites and disease type organisms, how are they adapting and changing in the current environment today? And so that's a large and central focus of the course. One other quick caveat, I would just say that my answers, as I already said, are going to be in the context of who my audience is. But I'm also providing answers to questions that students have that are kind of, a lot of them are deeply personal questions. And so some of my answers will also kind of include a personal component to it. All right, so I'm an educator teaching a scientific class on science, and I'm going to try to represent the consensus scientific view of the theory. But some of these questions really go beyond evolutionary theory, in which case I will say this is my own personal perspective, or here's a variety of different perspectives that some people have provided to the type of question you've just asked. Right? All in the name of trying to allow students to engage with this topic and hear like what do other people believe, and what forms of evidence do people bring to play to try to answer these types of questions. All right, so with all of those caveats, all right, let's dig into Answering Student Questions Part 2. Coming on up. Okay, first question. This is just kind of to get me warmed up. I'm going to have a lot to say here about some of these questions coming up. So I'm going to try to get into a groove here. In the first chapter, we learned that whales were mammals that evolved to live in the sea. Or I'm going to phrase it this way, or I think it would be a better phrase it. We learned that we examined the evidence that whales are mammals, and that there are mammals that once lived on the sea and once lived on land and have evolved or changed or adapted to live in the ocean. This was discovered by studying fossils and whales today. in addition to a whole bunch of molecular biology evidence that we also talked about. Do you think that there are species that have done or may do the opposite and go from living in the sea and evolve to live on land? If so, what changes do you think we would see in their fossil record? For example, would we see flippers on organisms turning into arms and legs? Okay, so basically the question is, could organisms evolve from living in the water to living on land versus the example in the text, which was living on land, moving into the water? So evolutionary biologists and paleontologists who have looked at the evolution of a variety of different organisms have identified a number of different kinds of organisms that they believe have evolved either from water to land or land to water. And the most obvious example of this would be land animals themselves. But rather than talk about that particular transition, because it's kind of famous, and there's going to be some discussion in the text about that later in the class, when we talk about macroevolution, I would like to take a slightly different tact and just do a thought exercise on what it would take for an animal living in the water today, let's say living in the ocean, a vertebrate living in the ocean. What would it take for them to live on land today? Why don't we see that happening today? Right? If you just actually way back in the Devonian, there was these fish that learned how to take advantage of food resources that were on land and adapted to this land environment. Why don't we just see that happening over and over and over again in history? If it can happen once, why can't it happen twice or 3 times or 4 times and so forth? And so here's one way of thinking about it. And I don't have the pictures to go with it, but I do believe I showed this in class at least one time. Is I think about something like the Jumping Lenny, right? And I've done some other, I've actually written about the Jumping Lenny in other places. The Jumping Lenny is a really interesting fish. All right, it's a teleos fish, so bony fish, but it lives on rocks, like rocky shores, and it lives above the water. There's one particular species. There's actually there's a lot of different species of blenny. There's one that's particularly good at living out of the water, and it actually prefers to live out of the water, right? If this fish falls back into the water as waves come up, it generally tries to get out of the water and live back up on the rocks, where it scours food from the algae and so forth on the rocks, and it even hides in little pockets in the rocks. It needs to be wet all the time, but it also actually breathes through its skin in addition to its gills. So it's very adept at breathing skin, much better than other fish are. So it has that adaptation, all right? It's learned to, compared to other species that are very similar to it, it's learned to get its oxygen, right, from the air in a different way than its other relatives. And the reason it's a jumping blenny is because it can actually bend its oh boy, I don't know my fish terminology. Let's just say it's tail fin. It can contort its body and push off with it, and actually throw its body farther up onto land, onto rocks that are higher up. And it's got little fins too that are sort of branch out, and they kind of use them to pull themselves along too. All right, so they look like not very elegant, right? They're kind of like flopping around, throwing themselves around. Yet at the same time, they survive, right? They survive in this environment, and they can't completely dry out. But on the other hand, they definitely don't live in the ocean. They live outside the ocean. So now, why do I bring them up? Look, they're living on an island, on islands out in the Pacific Ocean, and they had the potential, right? With a few more mutations, they could continue to get better at breathing air. They could continue to get better at moving themselves around by increasing their muscle mass and their various fins. They could get better at jumping, right? They could do a bunch of different things in order to make themselves better adapted living on land. And, it's a fairly wet environment on that particular island. They could learn to eat other resources on that island as well, other types of plants. And over a long period of time, you could see that they could maybe get resources that their relatives, which are still living in the ocean, have no access to at all, right? And here they are, they're like kind of already halfway have access to that stuff. They're closer, right, to the land. They already have some adaptions. So you could predict that potentially they could become land vertebrates someday, some kind of new kind of land vertebrate, because they're already on, they've already transitioned halfway to land. But I'm going to suggest that's highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. And the reason it's highly unlikely is because they got a big problem. If they want to make the next step, and it's not that their genome is incapable of having mutations that might allow them to gain new characteristics and be able to be better adapted living on land. That's not the problem. The problem is there's a whole bunch of predators on that land, right? There's a whole bunch of things called birds, all right? Birds that would love to eat fish. And there's probably other kinds of animals, right? There could be on some of those islands like lizards or something like that, that might be perfectly fine picking up a flopping around fish that is not very elegant, can't walk yet, and is sort of scrambling along the ground to try to find resources. In other words, if they take another step out, if they venture out a little farther onto land and not in their little protective crevices, in the sides of the rocks, they're going to find themselves pretty easy pickings. So that's natural selection, right? The environment around them is the selector, and the selector includes a bunch of fish and a bunch of other predators. And those predators are going to consistently kill off any blenny fish that have any mutations that would give them any change in behavior that allowed them to seek out new resources on land. Even if they could see that there's a good resource out there for their survival, the moment they try to get it, they're going to be dead. In which case, what happens? The genes, right? Any adaptation they have that would make them more fit for that particular environment, well, they're not actually fit for that environment because they got killed, right? So the blenny is kind of stuck, right? They're adapted for what they do, which is living in the crags of the where the waves are hitting up against the rocks. It's a very unique environment. And so they're way better adapted for that environment. You could say, going back to one of our other questions, they're the most evolved, right? Right? I would say they're best fit for that particular environment compared to any other organism. And so they have changed very much from their relatives, a bunch of blennies that are swimming around down there. But they're not really going to be able to take the next step and live on land. Right? They are what they are, and natural selection is probably going to keep them the way they are, unless there's some great disaster and all their predators are removed. So if the environment changes, then there would be an opportunity, because they would just be kind of like the original amphibians, right? The original lobe-fin fish that are making a living by pushing themselves up on the shore and procuring food resources on land, and there's no competition for them, and so they very much are enticed to do that. And any mutation in that population that allows one individual in that population or a few individuals in that population to be able to push themselves farther up on land or breathe air a little bit better would allow them to then get even more resources, which does what? Makes them potentially more fit, have more offspring. Their offspring then are able to be a little bit stronger, breathe a little bit more oxygen through their changing lung structure, right? They may not be, if they were alive today, those initial members that are climbing up on land, they would be picked off by birds. They'd be picked off by you and I. I mean, they would be easy pickings, in which case they never would have turned into land animals, right? But with the lack of competition, the lack of predation, all they have to do is survive. They don't have to be amazing. They don't have to be able to run 5 miles an hour. All they have to be able to do is stay alive. And if you don't have predation, you can be extremely inefficient on land But even in the inefficiency, you might still be getting a lot of food, in which case you're going to be very successful, right? Instead of having to compete with all those fish, right, in the water, which are all competing for the same food resources, you're up there getting new food resources that nobody else can get. It's a big advantage. We'd call that directional selection. That is, and that's probably fairly strong selection. Like any new characteristic that gave you a little bit better ability to move onto land would be favored. And so you're going to constantly get better and better and better and better at living on land. Whereas the Pacific Blenny is kind of like, the Pacific Jumping Lenny is, it's kind of stuck. It's like, it's done a great job of sort of adapting to this really unique environment. And it's like, kind of like a land fish. It even has its young, like out of the water, in water, but only in little tiny pockets of water. And even their young are already adapted to living outside the water. Okay, so that was a much longer answer than I thought I would give for this question. But all right, let's move on. I'm warmed up now, though. A question about Buffon. All right, so Buffon lived in the 1700s, and we talked about him when we talked about a number of different historical characters who made important contributions to our understanding of the world, whether it be the true nature of fossils, various geological ideas, right, about the history of formations on Earth, and then, of course, about the origins of organisms and the observations that organisms are different at different times or different ages. So Buffon is very early in that. All right, so this question comes to us and it says, Buffon claimed that the Earth was created from a comet that struck the sun, breaking off particles that formed that planet. From those particles that made up the Earth from this collision, along with the addition of water, he proposed that living things were created. This organic matter somehow was transformed into an egg or seed that created an adult form. We know from science, I guess he's saying, the question is, well, we know today from the things we've learned over the last 300 years, that at least for mammals, a sperm needs to fertilize an egg to create offspring. So if Buffon's theory is correct, how would these certain species be created from these particles? All right. I don't have any idea how that would happen because, of course, the consensus view of science today is that this is an outmoded idea and it really is unrealistic, right? So, and I can't even imagine how Buffon would have thought that. I don't think he certainly wouldn't have known about the mechanism, right? He wouldn't have known about anything about genetics. He wouldn't really even know about cells in many ways. He knew that there were sort of particles, right? We knew about something like sperm and egg or how organisms began, but in a very, very crude way. Buffon comes from a time in which there was a great interest in sort of really flamboyant, descriptive works. People were writing books on like the history of the world. And he wrote several different like totality of like trying to explain everything, really from a kind of a naturalistic point of view, which would have been quite radical in the day, given that most presentations of the history of the world would have very much been from, in European countries anyway, from a sort of a Judeo-Christian viewpoint. So Buffon is interesting. So what Buffon's doing here is he is proposing some kind of spontaneous generation, right? He's recognizing that there is matter in the world because he's trying to explain, well, if the Earth originated as pieces of material flying around or spun off from the sun, all right, and then cooling, well, there wouldn't have been any life there. So then where did life come from? Well, life had to have originated somehow. And if he's not going to point to a supernatural creator, then he's got to come up with some kind of explanation, right? So, and that's where these wild speculative ideas come from. That okay, well, maybe there was little bits of, combining it with water. We know water is really important with respect to all living things have water in them. Maybe somehow that water has then transformed into living things, spontaneous formation of these things that then grow up. And we saw later that you have Lamarck come along, and Lamarck's also kind of like everything starts as these simple bacteria, and then they change into different forms, but they're constantly being created. Like there's lots of different forms of organisms that are constantly being created all the time. All of this represents sort of the environment that exists, the environment of the types of thought that exist leading up to Darwin. Because we said that Darwin doesn't just appear in a vacuum, right? Darwin has ideas that are partly built upon this foundation of other people having thought of ideas. All right, don't want to spend any more time here because we have some other big questions, so let's move on. In Chapter 3, we learned that the oldest evidence of life dates to tentatively 3.7 billion years. This evidence was found in the forms of rocks containing carbon. This statement makes sense as all organisms contain carbon, since it's an essential element of life. Therefore, the first rocks containing carbon could be considered the first sign of life. My first response to that would be, okay, actually the 3.7 billion thing, I think actually refers to possible evidence of a stromatolite or an bacterial film. And as we said, that there's been some debate about that particular piece of evidence, but there's something that's slightly older now, that's 3.9 billion years. And that has to do with the findings of what appear to be something like stromatolites, which is a type of structure that bacteria typically build. And it's not just the physical appearance of that looks like a stromatolite, but it does have to do with the fact that there is carbon, like actual remains of carbon atoms that are concentrated in this particular piece of rock. And those carbon atoms have been analyzed, and you remember that carbon comes in a number of different isotopes, right? There's carbon-12, carbon-13, carbon-14, and organisms like you and I, and really all organisms on Earth, when we take in carbon and to build organic molecules, we have a preference for using carbon-12. And so compared to the natural ratios in the environment, living things have a much higher ratio of carbon-12. So in some of these rocks, and this can be done for lots of other much younger fossils as well that have carbon content. If you look at the carbon and you analyze the individual atoms and ask what's the ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-13, if there's a much higher ratio of carbon-12 to 13 than you would find just in the environment, because there is lots of carbon in the environment, right? There's lots of carbon in the world that's not part of living things, right? That's incorporated into other molecules, like carbon dioxide, right? And so that carbon, if you find a ratio that's skewed toward the type of ratio you find in living things, then what does that suggest? That suggests that there was a living thing present in that sediment, right? That dies, decays, but the carbon remains, right? It's the molecules, the molecular bonds break down, but the actual atoms still persist. And so that carbon that is removed from that rock in the analysis has that skewed ratio. You say, like, that means, that suggests, that you can infer from that there was a living thing present there. And so in the very, very, very early rock record of ancient rocks that are 4 billion years old, up to like 3.9 billion, or maybe a little bit younger, we haven't found rocks that have that skewed carbon ratio. And then you begin to find rocks that have things that look like they could be the remnants of like bacteria films, like where aggregates of bacteria were. Not that you actually see the cells themselves, but you see the sort of the structure that's made by cells living together, or the disruption of how they aggregate sediment together and so forth. And then you analyze that carbon there and you see that skewed ratio. Those are the types of things that are suggested to represent some of the first evidences of life on Earth. So, what else do we have here? This information was very interesting to learn about, but I was just wondering if you could possibly elaborate more on the ideas of how early evolution and the origin of life could be connected, applied to present-day evolution topics such as viral, bacterial evolution, and the creation of new species. Right. So throughout the course, I don't really talk much, and really your book doesn't deal with the origin of life. There's really very, very little mentioned about the origin of life because that's abiogenesis, I don't want to call it a completely separate field or discipline, but it is a separate idea or theory, right? The theory of the origin of life. How did life originate? Evolutionary biology is really speaking to how organisms adapt and change. So you have a living thing. How does that living thing respond to the environment? How does it change and adapt to the challenges that the environment presents us with? And so as you look at those adaptations, you can expand that out and ask, like, over long periods of time, how have organisms adapted in really large and significant ways, and the patterns of that change over time. But that doesn't actually address the question of the origin of life, right? So it is kind of a separate topic. Now, there could be overlap between evolutionary theory and abiogenesis theory, all right? And that overlap could be that there could be mechanisms of evolutionary biology, because that's mostly what we're dealing with in this class. You probably realize that by now, that the vast majority of an evolutionary biology class is really population genetics, right? It's all about how organisms are experiencing change to their genomes based on the environment and on other factors like genetic drift and so forth, the random effects of passing down genes. And so those mechanisms potentially could have something to do with the origin of life. But even those mechanisms would have to work in a somewhat different fashion on, say, molecules, right? So that's something called molecular evolution, right? The origin of life, and how life might have emerged, if you want to theorize about a naturalistic formation of life on Earth, then you could say that there had to have been some kind of evolution of complex biomolecules. Right. Now I'm using the word evolution just in the sense of change, all right, in its most basic sense. Because now we're not talking about the change of living things. We're talking about changes in biomolecules, like nucleic acids and proteins, right, RNA and so forth. How are those biomolecules made in an environment where there's no living things? Right. So those things form the basis for genetic information and biological functions. And so there's a whole bunch of theories about which biomolecules would have to occur first, how would they be combined with each other, how would you actually create biomolecules in an environment that doesn't have living things and compartments that are actually producing them using genetic information, right? And so that's includes a whole bunch of other types of theories and other mechanisms that go beyond evolutionary biology, which are the basic mechanisms of once you have a cell, how does that cell proceed to change over time? Or how does that cell proceed to interact with its environment? So, and to be honest, I'm just going to say it, the origin of life is something that is thought to have occurred a long, long time ago, right, on the Earth, right? So if evolution has been proceeding for several billion years, and not too many evolutionary biologists believe that new life has formed, say, in the last 2 billion years, right? That there is an abiogenetic event that occurred within the last 2 billion years. And you might ask, well, why not? I mean, if life could have originated much longer ago, why hasn't it continued to originate? Oh, that actually kind of goes back to my example of the Pacific Lenny, right? I said, you might have a unique event in which vertebrates adapt to living on land. And that unique event happens because there's no competition, and there's no selectional force to sort of like stop that from happening. In fact, there's selection to actually have it occur because there's an advantage to having that happen. But once that niche is filled, right? Once the land has land vertebrates on it, those land vertebrates become a selectional factor that prevents other land vertebrates from evolving. And so one explanation for not seeing the origin of new life later in the history of the Earth, is that once there's life, if there's any kind of like set of biomolecules that are combining in certain ways such that they make pieces of DNA or RNA or proteins that self-replicate. There's living things around that are like, oh, that's like some pretty yummy food you're just making there, right? They're going to just absorb those molecules and use them as food for themselves, right? It would be an exceptionally difficult environment in order to have self-assembly of different molecules and for them to be undergoing different forms of natural selection and gradually building more complex molecules through some really interesting biochemical processes, right? That might take millions of years, all right, of molecules basically replicating themselves. It's not going to happen in this present world. The other argument against the origin of life in more recent times is simply that the original conditions no longer exist today. Well, actually, that's very similar to what I just said, because the original conditions don't exist. And that's part of the problem with the origin of life theory as well, too, is we don't even really know what the original conditions were of the Earth. So there's a lot of, you have to kind of speculate. I mean, there are ways to find evidence in terms of the rock structure, in terms of the biochemistry of rocks that are formed at that time. So it tells us something about the chemistry of the world long ago, which was clearly very different. But it still leaves lots of unknowns, a lot of unknowns. And it's so far back in time that it's hard to theorize about in some ways. So this is a long-winded way of saying that this class is about evolutionary biology and the mechanisms of how organisms change, and mostly what we're concerned with is like how the present-day world actually functions. Right? It's a very practical thing, like how do organisms actually continue to survive in this world right now? And then we talk about, okay, if these things are true, this might also actually explain how the origin of lots of different groups, in fact, the origin of all living things from life. Then you get to talk about, then you might want to talk about what is the origin of the original life form. But that gets more speculative as you get deeper, and it's a whole different set of theories. And so I did put a paper on our Brightspace on your class information site that has like a whole bunch of different potential explanations for the origin of life, just in case you're curious about like what are different ideas that scientists have had about this. Okay, so now, moving on, we've got this very long question. As someone who was raised in a strictly Catholic household, I did not know much about evolution until my mid and late teenage years. My elementary and middle school schooling completely phased out any mention of the topic. As a result, I developed a strong interest in the subject, which has resulted in some of my family members reaching out to me with clickbait articles involving evolution. I have been sent articles, by the way, I think it's fascinating this person mentions that, as a result of them having not heard anything about the topic and it being completely phased out, they developed a strong interest in the topic. Sometimes, in trying to avoid a topic, we tend to inspire in our kids a keen sense of curiosity, all right, about a topic. Since you don't address it, well, there must be something really interesting about that. So then people go out and seek those types of seek information about that. I have been sent articles claiming humans will most certainly lose their fingernails and their pinky toes. Okay, so I've been sent articles claiming humans will most certainly lose their fingernails and their pinky toes. I cannot rule that out with certainty that humans will keep their fingernails or their pinky toes, but I do not think it's something that can be predicted with certainty. I completely agree with that. You certainly cannot predict that with certainty. My question is, how seriously is evolutionary speculation taken? When I read articles about humans losing their pinky toes within a few generations, I know immediately to disregard most of the information, as you should. Right? If you read an article, any of you read an article about how some particular species is going to lose this character within a few generations, in almost every case, I can pretty much guarantee that they don't know what they're talking about, and you should not listen to that information. I can think of one quick exception. If you were to take fish all right, and grow them in the complete absence of light. Within a few generations, you wouldn't be far off if you were to predict that some of the fish, some of the descendants, would lose their ability to see. Right? They would have a mutation that would render them incapable of seeing. That is a relatively safe prediction, to say within tens of generations that you would probably start seeing some fish that have lost sight. But that's an extreme selection environment. In the case of human beings losing their toes and pinky toes, absolutely not. Okay, where was I? I know immediately to disregard most of the information, but an article about whales losing their hip bones that they do not use seems very realistic to me. Should all of this skepticism, or should all this predicting of humans and whales be taken with the same amount of skepticism because there are so many different requirements and chance happenings that go into a species evolving? Or do some speculations hold more certainty in the scientific community? All right, now we got a couple things to unpack in this particular question. And a lot of questions come down to defining terms, all right, or misuse of terms. And we can be really sloppy in our use of terms at times. And that can lead us into a lot of trouble when we're talking about a very sort of well-developed academic field. When it comes to evolutionary speculation, and I don't like the word speculation, I think we have to differentiate between scientifically supported theories and just pure speculative ideas. Right? We're all apt to speculate about things like what could happen. And often those things that we're speculating about, we might have some rationale behind. Like I just suggested that if you took some fish, and you took a population of fish and you just kept them in complete darkness, and you continue to feed them, give them resources and so forth. Eventually, some of those fish would lose their sight. Now, am I speculating about that? I am predicting that will probably happen, but I'm not actually speculating because I know from lots of other examples in history that this has happened. I know that it's actually been shown in a lab, all right, to occur. And so for me to predict that would happen is based on knowing how population genetics works, how I know something about the fact that there are genes, and there's a whole bunch of different genes that are necessary for your eyes to function, right? And so since there's a lot of genes, I also know that genomes, when you copy them, we make mistakes. No organism can copy their genome perfectly. And so if you have several thousand fish and they're all copying their genomes as they're making their eggs and sperm, and they're making hundreds of thousands of eggs and sperm, I can be pretty confident that at some point, even by chance, or I can't tell you which fish, that mutation is going to happen over there, right? I can only tell you that out of all those mutations, some mutation is going to occur in one of those dozens of genes that are super important for vision and might knock out the function of that particular gene, in which case that fish will no longer be able to see. And in that particular population, that might not be such a bad thing because they don't need sight because they can't see anyway, right? There's nothing to see. And in a black environment, a dark environment, fish that no longer are able to see are no longer using the energy to try to see, right? It takes a lot of energy to try to visualize. When you close your eyes at night, you're using less energy than when your eyes are open, right? Your brain is using a lot less energy. So there's actually an advantage to being blind if you live in an environment where eyesight is not necessary. And so that's why you'll see fish develop, right? It appears that they're evolving the lack of ability to see. In fact, they are evolving that characteristic. They're not doing it intentionally, but it happens because natural selection will eventually lead to that particular outcome because mutations are happening and it's going to select for those mutations. All right, long way around to saying that that's not speculation for me to make those predictions. Now, speculation, I think that saying, well, in a few generations, we're going to lose our pinky toes. Somebody might argue that, well, that's not speculation. We're not really using our pinky. If you cut off your pinky toe, you can still walk around. Right? It's like, so you don't need it. All right. And if you don't need it, then you're going to lose it. Isn't that one of the principles of evolutionary biology? You know, you got to use it or you're going to lose it. Well, okay, that is an idea that if you're not actively utilizing something, so it's not important for your survival, then mutations can knock that out and you won't be able to do anything about it because the mutation knocks a characteristic out. If you're not using it, well, then that mutation will persist into future generations. If it was a really important gene and you have a mutation and then it causes you to be less fit, well, then that mutation is not going to be passed down as easily to future generations. So what about this pinky toes thing? Pinky toes and fingernails. I don't know, I guess we could talk about why they might be important. It's really hard to show that a characteristic has no function at all, that it's completely neutral. That would be another way of putting it, especially in our class. Is that characteristic neutral? If you have a pinky toe, but I don't have one, are we equal in the sense of our fitness? I can survive just as well as you can with my pinky toe as you can without your pinky toe. We would then call that a neutral characteristic. Now, with that characteristic, would I predict that character then will disappear out of the human population in the near future? I hope you know the answer is absolutely not, right? Or you're going to get the question wrong on the test. It's like characters like that are neutral in a large population, like the human population is huge. That character is not going to be lost, even if it has no function, right? Even if pinky toes don't have any real function for us, that character will not be lost from the population in any near term, not even in the midterm, maybe not even really in the long term, if the long term is hundreds of thousands of years. And you know that because of population genetics. Right? If I have a mutation, right, cutting your toe off isn't good enough, right? Because I have the genes for making pinky toes, I'm going to give them to my kids. But if I have a mutation in one of my sperm, and I give that mutation to my offspring, and that offspring now has the mutation, some mutation developmentally that says, don't form this pinky toe. Like maybe you started forming pinky toe, but you stopped forming it, and you just have 4 toes. And I give that to one of my kids. And that child is just as capable of survival, living the same lifespan, and just as likely to have offspring, right? Potential future mates don't look at him and go like, oh, you're missing a toe, I can't mate with you, right? So there's no sexual selection. All right, so you're missing that toe. All right, so now you have to ask the question, how long will it be before everybody in the human race is missing a toe? All right, one of my children has more children, and maybe they pass that characteristic down to a couple of them. But my other kids are also going to have kids, and they don't pass that down. And then maybe some of the kids are the ones that pass down no toe actually don't have children in future generation, right? This is the whole thing with neutrality, right? It's just genetic drift. There's no selection. If you're not selecting for it, it's darn near impossible, as you all well know by now. It's nearly impossible for a character that's in extremely low frequency, because it just came into the human population, this new characteristic, for it to then increase in its frequency over many generations and eventually sweep through the entire population such that we all have that particular characteristic. How long would that take? You can run the models, and you run the models, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of generations. And if it's truly neutral, even after hundreds of thousands of generations, it's highly unlikely that character will have ever reached any kind of significant percentage in the human population. So what would cause pinky toes and fingernails to disappear if they were a disadvantage? Right? They would have to be a disadvantage. If suddenly pinky toes became a disadvantage, oh, you've got a pinky toe? I'm afraid, that's super ugly to me. I'm not interested in mating with you because you have pinky toes. Well, then you wouldn't have any offspring, right? And somebody who doesn't have a pinky toe might have more offspring then. And if that continues over generations, it will eventually become the predominant characteristic. in the human population. How long would that take? Depends on the strength of selection, right? The selection coefficient, right? If it's an extremely strong selectional, you have extremely high selection coefficient, meaning if you have a pinky toe, there's no chance you're going to reproduce. And if you don't have a pinky toe, you have a really good chance of reproducing. If you do have a pinky toe, you have no chance of reproducing. Well, then of course it's only going to take hundreds of generations before everybody has no pinky toe. But as long as it's not 100%, right? As long as it's just like there's a slight disadvantage if you have a pinky toe versus not having a pinky toe, then you're talking about tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of generations. It inevitably will happen, because if the natural selection happens, natural selection will eventually cause the shift of one characteristic to another characteristic, but it will take an extraordinarily long time. And so that's why I say to questions coming up, I'm spending a lot of time on this because I know that we have several questions coming up that are very much related to this question about changes in human populations over time. And we talked about it in the first set of questions as well. It's not realistic, really, to think that humans are changing those kind of characteristics at any kind of rate that is meaningful for you and I in terms of your offspring or your offspring's offspring or your offspring's offspring or offspring's offspring's offspring, all right? That human populations aren't changing that fast. Okay, so back to this speculation thing. So this really is speculation. So this idea of losing pinky toes, that's, I guess you could call that speculation. It's certainly not based on any, it's not based on a knowledge of evolutionary biology, right? If you understood the mechanisms of evolutionary biology, you would be able to spot that and say, that really is highly unlikely, right? Based on everything we know about evolutionary biology, that can't be true. In which case, if somebody is telling you, well, this is true, well, then they really are truly speculating, right? They are truly just making something up and hoping that's true. It's not evidence-based, right? They don't have any evidence for it. So, I would say that some people, we have people and scientists have had wild speculations about things, right? In the absence of having any evidence or any way to generate a hypothesis, you just have to speculate and then ask yourself, is there anything I can use to test that speculation? And then when you test it, maybe you find evidence that supports that speculation. All right, so back to the last part of this question. Should all of the predicting of humans and whales be taken with the same amount of skepticism? Well, right. What I just said about the human beings and pinky toes and fingernails, it is wildly inconsistent with anything we know about evolutionary mechanisms. All right, the way population genetics works, the way that just biology functions today, and how we would expect it to continue to function in the future. Right? So that would be just speculation to say that that's what's going to happen. Whereas the whale thing, so when we talk about whales losing hip bones, that's actually based on an observation by looking at the fossil record. And so you see the reduction of the hip bone over time. And from those observations, you can draw a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that they have reduced that at one time they had large hip bones in the past as they were adapting to the sea. And then as they became more and better adapted to living in the ocean, we see fossils that have smaller and smaller and smaller hip bones, because presumably those bones weren't necessary, and therefore any mutations that caused the hip bones or portions of the hip bones or development of the hip bones to be lost eventually became part of those populations. So that becomes a hypothesis. That hypothesis can be further tested, again, by looking at maybe genetics, and actually looking at the genes that are making hip bones versus the genes in land animals. And so that isn't speculation. All right, you're starting with a reasonable inference from the evidence, you're drawing a hypothesis and then you're testing that hypothesis. Now, you may never be able to prove that hypothesis, but it's far more than just a wild speculation, right? I mean, I just sort of made that up about what happened to hip bones. No, you have actual evidence in front of you that actually fits in a consistent way with the predictions that we would make using evolutionary biology, which is based on observations of what happens to organisms in the present day. So yes, do some speculations hold more certainty in the scientific community? Well, again, I don't like the word speculations there, but I'll say, do some hypotheses hold more certainty in the scientific community or are better supported by the scientific community? Yes. Right? The reduction of hip bones is supported by a number of different forms of evidence. And so I would say that observation and hypothesis is fairly well supported and accepted by the scientific community. Other ideas for which have less support are held more tenuously, right? We're not as committed to those things where there isn't scientific consensus, and therefore more testing is needed, right? We need more observations in order to sort out, will this hypothesis hold up over time? So on to the next question. The past 2 weeks I was doing research in the biology department. Several projects, interesting, involved. I don't want to say what was involved because then some of you might know what they were doing. In this project, we're specifically looking with how this particular organism reacts with certain predators. Snakes are a well-known predator of this organism in many regions. However, there aren't any snakes in this particular, in this place, and there haven't been for hundreds of years. So this group was looking, one particular research group was looking at whether this particular organism still recognized snakes as a predator after all that time. The gist of this question is, or this research is, we observe that there's an organism here, and if you introduce it to a snake, they're just kind of like, what are you? Like, am I supposed to be scared? I don't know who you are, right? There's no reaction to them. And there's another observation. The observation is snakes haven't been around in this particular place where this organism lives for a long time. Now, in the question it says for 100 years. I actually went and did a little bit of research, and I believe that there's actually no evidence there's ever been snakes in this particular place. It happens to be an island. And there doesn't seem to be evidence that snakes have ever persisted there in the past at all. There does happen to be snakes there today because human beings have managed to bring snakes there in recent times. So the idea is that you have an organism that has lived on this particular island in the absence of snakes, all right, since its origins. So this group is looking to see if this organism still recognizes snakes. And the results showed a trend that this organism does not elicit any fear response, all right? So they don't have any fear of snakes. So a hypothesis would be that the reason they don't fear snakes is because they don't have any experience with snakes, right? Just like you've probably heard stories of animals that have no fear of people, right, when they first encounter them, because they're just like novel and brand new to them. I find it interesting that these animals sort of forgot this predator. I'm going to say they didn't necessarily forget the predator. I'm going to say that those animals on those islands, well, if they came from the mainland originally, they did have experience with snakes. And then when they migrated, found a way to migrate to this island, they managed to get to an island that had no snakes. And then they've lived on that island for so long and had so many offspring, right? So for thousands of years, actually probably tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of generations, their offspring have never seen snakes, all right? And so the memory is lost over time. Now, I wouldn't say, by saying memory, it sounds like some kind of, consciousness or something like that, something ephemeral. But the memory, which is actually developed by, it's a behavior type that is actually partly genetic. And so the genetics of that memory, of that, we'll call it a reflex, all right? That reflex is lost over time. So this made me think a lot about evolution and leads to my question. Are there any other examples where species in predator-free or resource-rich environments have undergone significant evolutionary changes due to the lack of selectional pressures or selective pressures? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and if you know any other examples that shed light on the topic. There's lots of examples of this. Lots of examples. It's actually some of the best examples of organisms changing fairly rapidly. Some of the best examples of what I would call rapid evolution. And many of those go to one of my favorite examples, which is going to the Hawaiian Islands. Right, if you go to the Hawaiian Islands, there's lots and lots and lots of unique plants there. And those plants don't have any spines. They don't have any thorns. The vast majority of those plants don't make any toxic chemicals. Whereas if you go to Costa Rica, it's like every single plant is either trying to stab you to death, ants are jumping out on you, trying to bite you. They have chemicals in them that make them completely unpalatable. Right, so why is Hawaii different? Well, on Hawaii, there are, until humans brought them there, right, there aren't any big herbivores, right? And there aren't any other animals, or land animals, that live there that the plants would have to worry about being munched on. They didn't have to defend themselves. So in that case, the idea is there is no selection, right, for keeping those spines and those things. And so they just lost all those features. Kind of like this organism lost its reflexes for reacting to snakes. Now, after we brought herbivores to the Hawaiian Islands, it's not like all those plants just instantly evolved new spines. That takes lots and lots and lots of generations and a bunch of mutations. And so they've experienced a dramatic change there because many, many plants have gone extinct, because they simply couldn't defend themselves over a very short period of time to a brand new organism introduced into its environment. What about moa birds in New Zealand, right? Flightless birds. Actually, there's a bunch of different flightless birds on a lot of different islands. And almost all of those we think definitely had flight because that's how they got to those islands originally. And once they're on those islands, though, no snakes. So you don't have to worry about snakes eating your eggs and other predators that would eat their eggs. And so those birds could lay their nests on the ground instead of having to make them in trees. Once you're laying nests on the ground and your resources are on the ground anyway, there's not any reason to fly, right? And flying is an expensive process, right? It's an energetically expensive process. And so any individuals that have mutations that shorten their wings or reduce the size of their feathers or change their muscle structure so they don't have the muscles to be able to fly as well is going to be like, hey, well, I'm not using that energy anymore to fly, but I can use more of that energy now to find food on the ground and have more offspring. So there's a selection advantage to not being able to fly in those particular environments. So all of this is just yet another example of when the environment changes or organisms move to an environment where it has completely different predators or a lack of predators, you see fairly quick responses. And the quick responses can be one of two things. The quick response could be extinction. It's like, I just can't adapt this fast to this new environment. I've got a new predator and I can't handle that predator. But the response can also be to forget about those predators, in which case you can forget about all the defenses that you had for those predators as well. You're adapting to that local situation. Organisms don't adapt for something that could happen to them in the future, right? We already talked about there's no forward thinking, like I need this particular characteristic because, 10,000 generations from now, there could be a snake. I know there's snakes on some other continent. And I know that if they got here, I'm going to need to be aware of them. I'm going to need to have nests in trees, so I better not lose flight because of that future possible predator. No. Every organism, every individual is living in the moment and saying, what is my environment telling me? My environment's telling me there's no danger here, right, from snakes. And so therefore, individuals that take on behaviors of that particular environment are going to be best fit for that environment. Right? That is something that makes us humans a little bit different, right? We're aware of the processes, of evolutionary processes, of natural selection and so forth. And so we can be aware of both our effects on other organisms. We can also think about the future, right? We don't have to react just to our present. We can think about what the future could be. We can think about what the future climate can be. We can think about what the presence of different organisms are in our environment and how we'd be best prepared for them. So there is that kind of knowledge and ability to be aware of the future does actually change the way that we interact, and that does affect our changes in human beings. But going back to one of our other questions about are humans evolving? Well, of course they are. I mean, all humans are subject to natural selection and genetic drift and all the processes of evolution. It's just that we have changed the relative rates of some of those different forces. Life on other planets. Okay. I grew up in a Roman Catholic household, but the ideas and theories of evolution were never taboo. We simply accepted that everything was God's creation. However, one taboo topic in the house was the idea of the possibility of life on other planets. I simply see that the universe was created so infinitely large that there has to be at least some microorganism somewhere else at the very least. Other members of my family say otherwise and are adamant that we're alone because we hold dominion and as the smartest and most sentient creatures on the planet, created by God to govern and care for the other life around us. My argument is that even if that was the case, and we are the only higher thinking creatures, there should still be something the equivalent of a squirrel or something somewhere else in the universe. How can we know for certain that we're alone in the universe when the only things telling us that we are the Bible and the fact that, to our public knowledge, I like the hint to, the whole UFO thing that's happening right now, or is always happening, to our public's knowledge, that nothing has tried to contact us. Okay, so the question of life on other planets. I think the person asking this question is, they're making some really good points here, right? They're suggesting that if the universe is absolutely huge, right, which it is, absolutely, septillions of stars, which means there's septillions upon septillions of planets. And out of all those planets, this goes, now of course we're going to be touching on the idea of the origin of life again. If you start with an assumption that that the origin of life can happen through some kind of natural process, right? There's some certain set of conditions under which amino acids and organic compounds can assemble in certain ways such that you could organize them eventually into something that's a cell that then also self-replicates, right? If you start out with that presupposition that is possible, then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, if there's septillions of planets, the vast majority might not ever have those conditions, right? But out of all those planets, you would think that the same conditions would have to arise several times. And so you'd think that the odds are that there would be other places that have life as well. Now, I'm touching on the idea that there might be different kinds of life, because how do you define life? That's a whole couple hour discussion itself. But let's say carbon-based life forms that have some kind of information storage vesicle, all right? Something like DNA. Could be RNA, could be something like that, all right? You would say that statistically speaking, it seems likely that there's other forms of life on other planets. Now, this person's also recognizing, like, hey, it doesn't mean that there's people on other planets. This raises also, I have to point out that this is the whole thing of, like, if you replay the tape, if you were to go back and say, like, if I were to take the Earth back in time, then you had the origin of life, and then you were to allow it to evolve again, would we have all the same organisms we have today? Right? Would we have human beings, and would we have all the different kinds of organisms we have today? And the answer to that, by some people who think about these types of things, is that there's no expectation to have the exact same thing, because all of those different organisms are evolving in the context of all the other organisms around them, right? And then, of course, there's external factors. There's comets, there's impacts, there's volcanism, there's all these different things that have then disrupted the process of different species forming. And so to say that we'd have exactly the same species or exactly the same kind of living, the exact same life on Earth today if you were to redo all of history, would be to say that somehow every single event would have to have happened the same way. But it's like the butterfly effect. If you had one small difference somewhere along the line, and you had bacteria, the multicellularity evolved in a slightly different way with slightly different genes, you might not get the clear distinction between animals and plants, right? And fungi. You might get some other group that has an amalgam of different features that we don't have today. But on the other hand, I think most biologists would say that the thing about the world today is there's a certain economy to it. You have herbivores, you have phototrophs, things that gather energy from the sun, well, and chemotrophs too. All right, they're building molecular organic molecules. Then you have heterotrophs. You have organisms that thrive and eat and basically consume other organic molecules that other organisms have made. And you have detritivores, right? You have fungi. You have other organisms that eat things that are dead, all right? So, but which is really just a way of saying they're also eating organic compounds that something else has made, right? And then on land, you got trees and you have grass and you have large animals, you have small animals, you have insects, right? They each have a niche, right? They're each taking advantage of different resources. And the expectation would be that if you were to draw out everything again, you would get similar types of organisms. Yeah. It's kind of like looking at one continent versus another, right? If you go to one continent, if you go to Australia, you have a whole bunch of different types of organisms there that don't exist anywhere else. They fill certain niches. There's plants that are adapted to the desert. They're very different than the plants that are adapted to the desert in California, right? There's cacti there. There are no cacti in Australia, but there are plants that have spines there. So what you get is natural selection in the environment selects for characteristics, coevolution, right? Going back to another question again. You have the coevolution of similar characteristics by different means, but you end up with the same sort of endpoints. You end up with plants that have a whole bunch of features that help them survive in dry climates. But they get there in different ways. And their genes are all different. Like I have these genes that make a certain kind of stomate and opening, and the plants over there in Australia, they have a different set of genes that make a similar type of characteristic that allows them to survive in their environment. And so the idea is that you would get, if you did the whole Earth's life system again, what would you get? You would probably get something that had like a mix of all these different kinds of organisms in different environments that have these different types of features, like flying things, small creatures, detritivores, large carnivores. You would expect all those different types of organisms to exist. And I think that's why it's helpful to think about different continents, because different continents are like saying two different Earths, right? They've been separated by continental drift, for long periods of time, and they've each evolved a unique set of organisms, but they kind of fill the same roles. Flying squirrels here in North America, sugar gliders that are marsupials are in Australia, and to the untrained eye, they kind of look like the same type of organism, and they fit the same habitat, and they're both nocturnal, and they do similar things, but they're completely unrelated organisms. All right, so what does that have to do with this question? It suggests that if some form of life exists on another planet, and that form of life has existed long enough, it should develop into different things that fill lots of different niches in similar ways. And so you could kind of predict you should see similar types of organisms in different places. All right, now all of that, let me step back. I want to say that all of this rests on the idea that that making life from non-life is possible in this sort of naturalist, in a completely naturalistic way. So some of you might be convicted that that's not possible, that it takes supernatural intervention to make life, right? Maybe that's your conviction. And because maybe you look at the evidence for the origin of life and say like, well, that really is more speculative, right? I don't have like really firm evidence of how that would happen. And so it's like, I prefer to believe that this is a guided process, that a supernatural creator has made these things. So like just in here, we accept that it's all God's creation. For this person saying like, the universe was created infinitely large, there has to be at least some sort of organism. Now they're actually suggesting that maybe even if God is in charge, right, has made the universe, that he has given, because God has created the whole universe and is governed by the same rules. If I go to another planet, a water molecule is the same as a water molecule here. Erosion happens the same way. If I have carbon dioxide and I have nitrogen, they're going to potentially combine in the same types of way because the laws of chemistry operate in a similar fashion all across the universe. And so then you get back to the idea that, well, if those laws, and if they're the laws that God instituted, right? So if you have a theistic viewpoint of why the laws exist, you could say that the universe exists in such a fashion or was given the ability to generate living things. And then if you have evolutionary mechanisms at play, you could really predict that you would get similar kinds of organisms in similar habitats on other planets. I like this point here, that the argument be that in the case that only higher living creatures, there should still be other types of organisms. To say that because human beings are at the pinnacle, and again, this would be a perspective that says that man is specially created and is a kind of like a higher being than all other living things, right? Separated from all living things. Whether they're separated biologically or not, separated in the sense of being endowed with a special position in the universe. And this is where I think individuals who would believe this would say that they wouldn't expect there to be people on other planets. And by the way, even if you had a wholly naturalistic outlook on the origin and evolution of life and the history of the universe, I don't think that you should predict that there would be human beings on another planet based on everything I've just said. Right? If you replay the tape, right? The butterfly wings aren't flapping its wings aren't going to result in the exact same patterns every single time. And so you might be able to predict there could be a similar form of animal, but it certainly wouldn't be a human species. And then you could get into the whole consciousness thing and where does that come from, and maybe unique human attributes. And, fortunately, nobody asked me about that, so we don't have to talk about that. So I guess we could just, to kind of sum that up, the idea that human beings are unique and somehow have dominion over creatures on Earth, that's definitely a theological and philosophical perspective. All right, definitely rooted in religious belief. So I think it's really important at this point to recognize that what we're talking about here is, science and religion potentially having different perspectives and different approaches to answering really fundamental questions about why. Right? We're discussing in this class hypotheses about how biological organisms adapt and change in their environments, and what the possible inferences from that are. And one of the inferences is that all life might be related to one another. In fact, there is actual evidence, all right? There are actual arguments one could make that show that organisms are potentially related to each other or are related to one another. But nonetheless, you still have the question of sort of the why questions out there. There's no doubt that scientific discoveries have, at many times and intervals in the history, last several hundred years of history, have challenged previously held, I would say, religious and philosophical beliefs. The history of scientific progress includes instances where scientific understanding expands our perspective, like on our place in the universe. Right. Telescopes have certainly expanded our understanding of our place in the universe, and have actually asked us to forced us basically to ask questions that never would have been asked in the past. So how you individually, reconcile like scientific discoveries and your personal beliefs, and your why questions about the world. right, is really a very, it's a really deeply personal and subjective matter. And all I can do is say, here are explanations provided by science. All I can do is provide explanations that are like, here's what science can say about the origin of life and how organisms change. And here's the best understanding of scientific principles applied to these questions that we have today. Okay, I've been rambling on this question a whole bunch, and I'm kind of avoiding kind of giving a personal perspective on this. But I'll hold off because we got some other questions. We have some other related questions, so I promise I'm gonna touch on some more of these things. As someone who grew up overseas and attended Catholic school all her life, I was unaware about evolution until I did my own research about it in high school. Even in high school, my school refused to teach it to us. Therefore, do you think there's a way for Catholic schools to teach evolution without interfering with religion? If so, what are some ways you propose? All right. This is a really big question, and it's with some trepidation that I'm going to begin to attempt to answer some of these questions. And I'm going to take a kind of a simple approach to this very first question because we're going to have 2 or 3 other questions that are going to be very similar to this one. So I will provide different slices, if you will, of reactions to these questions at different times rather than trying to do it all at once right here. If you know any of my other work outside of class, then you know that I write and talk a lot about sort of what we call the integration of science and faith. So I do have a special interest in this area and have a lot of thoughts on it. But just sticking to this idea of like, how would you, here you're in a school or situation, or you have a background where maybe you've never learned anything about evolutionary biology because maybe that particular topic has been avoided. And it's probably been avoided because there's the perception that, and I don't want to say perception, the reality is that for many folks, their interpretation of the history of the universe and of life, they feel like evolutionary theory provides a contrary explanation that is outside of their beliefs. And therefore, they feel like they are in conflict and don't really want to experience that conflict, right? And so the best way to not experience that conflict is to simply avoid the conflict by not talking about it. And this is the route that many people in K-12 education go, is simply just like, well, let's just avoid the topic of evolutionary biology. One of the things I'd say about that, and you would know that taking this class, is that you've probably realized by this point that evolutionary biology, and when you take that textbook, and you say like, what am I learning from this textbook? And we go through it. The controversial parts of evolutionary biology in the largest sense that we're talking about consist of a very small segment of that book, right? Because what are we spending most of our time on? We're spending an enormous amount of time talking about natural selection as a process, like the population genetics of that. How do allele frequencies change over time? What influences are there in populations and on populations, both by other organisms and by the about abiotic forces in the environment? How are they affecting how populations are changing and adapting in this present world? Right? We're talking a lot about that. And then we explore the idea of speciation, about how populations are becoming fragmented and becoming more different from each other under different environmental conditions. Right? And we're talking about genetic drift, and we're talking about mutations. We're talking about processes that we can observe, processes that we test, processes that we can model. And then we're talking about observations from the fossil record to look at how organisms have changed and persisted and gone extinct in the past. And the vast majority of all of that is not at all controversial, and in fact is very helpful for understanding the balance of life on Earth. Why do we have the types of diverse organisms that we have? How do they all coexist? Why do organisms have certain features? And then we are in evolutionary biology trying to go to the next step and say, how did they get those features? How do plants have spines? What are the forces that enable organisms to develop characteristics to adapt to the challenges in their environment? And so we talk about genomes, and we talk about sexual selection, and we talk about a bunch of different factors that are involved in those things. We talk about viruses and how they're evolving to the organisms that they're inhabiting, and how we are adapting to the viruses in our habitat, and how bacteria are developing antibacterial resistance and so forth, right? We spend an enormous amount of time on what I would call very practical aspects of what you can learn from evolutionary biology that helps you understand today's world. All right, so that's a long-winded way of saying that if you avoid that topic, evolutionary biology, and often everything, the baby is thrown out with the bathwater, right? When you say, well, we're not going to talk about evolution. And so you don't even talk about natural selection. You don't talk about speciation. You don't talk about these things at all. Well, then you really are missing a large portion of biology. There's this phrase, nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. People hear that phrase and they think, well, that means I have to accept universal common ancestry of non-life becoming life and then becoming all different types of organisms. That to me is what evolution is. But really that phrase is saying it's hard to understand why this organism, this species over here has this characteristic living in this environment, whereas over here in this other environment you have another species and has slightly different characteristics. Why are those two things different? Why is this one color and this one's a different color? But evolutionary biology provides a robust scientific explanation, all right, for those types of differences. And hundreds of thousands of other features of organisms on the earth today can be understood within the light of evolutionary biology. And so I guess the first thing I'm saying is you're missing a lot if you just decide you're going to throw everything out and you don't want to talk about anything that smacks of evolution. So then when it comes to the question of, well, how would you teach evolution? Well, rather than teaching it in a adversarial sense, I think of it as just like I'm thinking of it in terms of this class. No matter what your perception or beliefs are about the origins of life, about the place of man in the universe, about the history of the earth in terms of its age or whatever, you should know what the scientific consensus is on explanations for living things and their diversity. What is the source of diversity in the world? And the most robust, best accepted explanation, naturalistic explanation for the diversity of living things is evolutionary biology, right? I can't come up with, I can't tell you any other theory that has been proposed based on natural mechanisms, scientific principles that better explains why we have the different types of animals and organisms that we do, right? You learned a little bit about Lamarck. We just saw something about Buffon. Buffon had an idea about the origin of living things. That's a terrible idea. I mean, there's really no scientific evidence for that. Lamarck had an idea, and it was popular for a time, but we've learned a whole lot, and it's fallen out of favor very quickly after Darwin came along, because Darwin had a just much better explanatory framework that takes account for a large amount of the evidence of the observations we make of this world. So, point number one is, I think it's just important that you know what evolutionary biology is, and you understand the mechanisms of evolution. And at the end of the day, as I say, you can look at that and say, like, okay, I get what natural selection is, and here's what it can do. Maybe I haven't convinced you, or you're not convinced by what you've learned from your textbook about how complex traits, like the origin of venom. And you're like, I just don't think that natural processes can make venom, despite whatever evidence that has been presented. And you choose to believe that there's something else involved in the origin of venom. Well, if you're going to add another explanation, and that explanation is a supernatural explanation, right? That God created an organism or they created organisms and then created the capacity for making venom in a certain organism. Then that's up to you to make that decision that there is another form of evidence. There's another explanation that you are more convicted by, right? But you should acknowledge that decision you've made is not based on scientific evidence. But if you feel like scientific evidence isn't all that there is in this world, and I would agree, scientific evidence isn't everything. It can't explain everything about the world, right? There's lots of why questions that it has difficulty approaching. Or let's put it this way, it can't address, scientific theories can't address questions of supernatural origins. Because if something is supernatural, it's outside the bounds of us being able to investigate it. So I would put it in the context of this is a scientific theory. All right, so evolution is a scientific theory. So in biology, you would emphasize that evolution has, here's the evidence for this particular theory. A theory is a well-grounded hypothesis. A hypothesis has been tested and found to be consistent with lots of evidence, right? And so multiple different disciplines in biology have converged to provide evidence that suggests that organisms adapt and change in the environment. And that as they adapt and change over long periods of time, that they can change from one species to another species over time, that speciation happens. And so this is the scientific explanation that explains the natural phenomena or the natural observations we make. Religion provides another framework for potentially understanding the origin of life. But I would say it more provides an explanation for the meaning or purpose of life, right? I can't really say a whole lot about what the purpose of a particular organism is in terms of, I can say what the purpose of a particular feature of an organism is within a naturalistic framework. But what's your purpose for being here? I don't really have any way of addressing that from the scientific perspective. Right? So in terms of teaching it and teaching alongside of or teaching it without interfering with religion, it doesn't interfere with religion if you present it as this is what you should know that science thinks. Like this is the current consensus. Maybe 200 years from now, there'll be a shift in our understanding of scientists' understanding. But currently, right now, this is the agreed upon best explanation to explain the observations that we've made of this world from the fossil record, from genetics, from morphological observations, from behavior, lots of different fields. All right, so with that, then you simply encourage the things you should be encouraging in the educational process, right? Critical thinking, right? Encourage people to explore different perspectives, understand what scientists are saying, what is the evidence they're using to support these different things. Examine that evidence for yourself and decide, is that a consistent explanation? And you might come to the conclusion that, you know what, there's a lot of evidence for human evolution, or a lot of evidence that, yes, there were, whales have so many features that are like land animals that it's not an inconsistent hypothesis, or it's not an improbable hypothesis that at one time they shared a common ancestor. At the end of the day, you still may decide that I weigh things, right? Here's my scientific evidence, and maybe I have my scriptural evidence, right? I have Genesis 1-4, and I believe it should be interpreted in a particular way. I have a particular interpretation of that I think is the most faithful interpretation. By the way, that also includes hermeneutics, which is methods of interpretation and so forth. So there's a whole kind of science to interpretation and understanding literature. But within your understanding of that, you may decide that whales are a separate creation. And that is another piece of evidence for you to consider in this world. You might decide, like, at least you would understand what evolutionists are saying. And you would at least understand, here's the evidence that they're providing, and you could have a rational conversation with somebody, say, like, I get that. That evidence does look compelling. I've chosen not to believe that because I place this evidence over that evidence. And here's the reason why I'm not going to believe, that aspect of evolutionary biology. But here's the thing. You could still agree that, dolphins are evolving, right? That they are adapting to their environment. And you could say that over the last 4,000 years, they've changed quite a bit. In fact, that's what we've seen, that's what creationists do. So-called creationists that deny evolution, except that they believe that, 2 dogs became 35 different species of dogs. So they believe in lots of speciation. They believe in natural selection. They believe in genetic drift. They believe in the processes that we're learning, although they have different takes on them in terms of the speed and rate. And so you have the ability to assess that kind of hypothesis, because their hypothesis is a kind of naturalistic hypothesis about the origin of different species of dogs. But they would say dogs and cats have separate origins, like they were supernaturally created separately. But after that, they evolved through natural processes. So that's already a combination of naturalism, of explaining, well, I guess put into a theistic form of language. That would be saying that God is using secondary processes, like he's using the mechanisms of the world that he created to allow for speciation to happen. But he didn't create those types of mechanisms, couldn't have created dogs and cats from a common ancestor. Or maybe you'll look at it and you'll say, I think they could have come from a common ancestor, but I believe that they didn't. Right? It's possible, but I don't believe they did. All right, I'm giving you lots of different, I'm spilling over lots of stuff here, but the idea is in class, if you can present at least, here's what the facts of what evolutionary biologists believe, and here is their evidence. Here's what you should know about it. You should at least know what they believe and what it is, because that way you won't fall prey to a bunch of misconceptions, which is this is what happens with a lot of people. There are a lot of creationists that use your misconceptions about what evolution is to sound convincing. And so you really should only be convinced by things that are true representations of your opponent. And the only way to know what evolutionary biologists say is to take a course like this to understand something about the basics of evolutionary biology. Now, I would also say that there's a ton of compatibility. Right? There's a ton of compatibility of our textbook. You're going to find that if you read 800 pages of this textbook, that you're probably going to, even if you come into a class and think like, I don't believe in evolution, like I don't believe in this evolution thing, you're going to find out that you're going to agree with 90% of the book, because you're going to realize that 90% of the book is about things that are just about how the world operates right now, in the here and now, and are processes that clearly are going on that can be tested. And there's abundant evidence, right? This is what organisms do and how they change and how they interact with each other. And so there is a large amount of compatibility between evolutionary theory and most every type of other belief about the origins and of life and diversification of life on Earth. I guess lastly I would say, out of all the things I'm forgetting to say, but I'll say this. This discussion forum is one very, very small way to have this kind of discussion, right? To be able to at least feel out, hey, different students have different ideas about things. They have different concerns. They have different perceptions of what evolutionary biology is. And they have different misconceptions about, even what religion might say. So there are students who don't know anything about some religious ideas, or even the conflicts that they might have with evolutionary biology. Maybe they're just fully accepting of evolutionary biology. They should be aware of why it is that when they just say, well, evolution is true, some people have very strong reactions to that. Why do they have those reactions? And so all of this is just to allow us to see is to experience the dialogue and differences among us. And to find out can we agree? Where do we agree? And I think that what you'll find is we agree on a lot once you boil it down, once you distill it down. Okay, we have to move on. I've got to move on to the next question. This is kind of a frustrating experience for me. I'm not real happy with my answers to this point. And if you might be wondering, like, well, usually I do this live. Like, how do I feel when I'm getting these questions? Like, I've not been able to look at it before. I'm just asked right in front of class, and I have to answer them. Amazingly, being spontaneous in front of a class and then like having a whiteboard and like drawing stuff is so much easier than sitting here and talking to a screen and trying to answer these questions. I find myself just not really getting into a groove. But let's see what happens here. I've grown up in a Christian household all my life and have attended Christian education throughout my life. I've always been fascinated by the topic of evolution, especially when it comes to humans. I even took an evolution and archaeology class in my high school. It was an interesting experience because there were topics in class that were taught and discussed that did not necessarily align with the Catholic Church taught. Is it possible to reconcile the scientific concept of evolution with teachings and beliefs of Christianity and other religions and hold similar views without causing tension and conflict? And so, okay, I just did a big, long, rambling answer to the previous question about how would one teach evolution in a school and what would they want to cover. So all I'll add to this is I think it's possible to have professional dialogue to teach students the facts, all right, of evolutionary theory, what evolutionary theory is, in a way that says, this is not something that I am forcing you to believe. This isn't a belief. This is simply, as a scientist, what do scientists do? They look for the best possible explanations for the observations they see in this world, right? We observe things in the world. We ask, how did that happen? How did that come to be? Why is that the way it is? And we come up with hypotheses and we test those hypotheses. And evolutionary theory is a theory, right? Which is a well-tested hypothesis. So let's try a little bit different approach here. All right, I'm going to say that in general, I think it is possible to reconcile the scientific concept of evolution with the teachings and beliefs of most Christian beliefs. And I'd say most other religions can find a lot of compatibility between the two. Not perfect compatibility, and so there's going to be tension. But tension isn't always, tension's just part of life. There's always going to be areas that we're not going to agree about. And it's finding ways to have effective communication and dialogue about those tensions and to appreciate where the differences are and why those tensions exist. So let me give you some ideas, or I guess maybe approaches to being able to reconcile the two things. Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that both are interpretations, right? We have interpretations of the evidence of the world around us and the use of the scientific method to come up with explanations for the physical observations, the observations of the physical world. But there is an aspect in which you have to recognize if you are looking at, say, the Bible. And again, we're taking a sort of a Eurocentric view on this. And so I want to acknowledge that, of course, there's other religions that have tensions with evolutionary biology. But the primary one that we'd be concerned with is right, a typical Judeo-Christian viewpoint. And so you have to remember that there's interpretation of text, right? Even religious texts, including the Bible, are going to be open to interpretation. And so if you are of, say, a Christian background or heritage, it would depend on which background you come from, right? Catholic, Protestant, and then within Protestant, you might have Baptist and Presbyterians and so forth. And even Presbyterians, you have different kinds of Presbyterians that have different approaches and interpretations of Scripture, right? Different interpretive frameworks to understanding what the Scriptures teach, right? So most religious scholars and theologians, they do interpret Scripture or creation accounts metaphorically or symbolically, right? That allows for a fairly harmonious understanding within scientific explanations and even evolution. But there are some that interpret Scripture in such a way that there is definitely conflict, definitely differences, definitely places where science says this, and my religious interpretation says this. And that's where one is faced with this, like, which one do I choose? And I tell people when they talk to me about questions like that, well, then how do I decide what to choose? And one of my first answers is, it's important that you don't think that you have to choose like today, all right? Because you have to understand that we're all learning, all right? I'm learning, even at my age. I find that I'm still trying to understand Scripture and religion better and trying to understand what true faith is. And I'm also trying to understand the science better. And I have had several different forms of tension, throughout my entire life. And I would say even today, I could point to a number of areas where I find tension between those two, right? That I have convictions, right? Religious convictions. And I have convictions based on science or what appears to be the best understanding of the evidence, right? The best theories. And they don't completely sync up. And that used to bother me because you kind of feel like, okay, today I gotta resolve this problem and I'm gonna have to choose one or the other. But what I have found is that the tensions I had in the past, many of those are no longer exist because either I came to a better understanding of, the text, all right, of Scripture, or I came to a better understanding of the science, which fit my understanding of religion better, all right? And it's kind of gone both ways. And so I've seen a shift over time in different positions, and I found like some tensions have kind of dissipated, whereas some other tensions have increased. Like I've found new tensions I didn't know existed in the past. Maybe they were always there, or in some cases they were generated by something new that I discovered, all right? Something new that I became convicted of in either area. And then I realized, well, this creates a new form of tension. And so all this is to say that if I have those tensions, but those tensions are changing, I shouldn't feel like that I'm at some absolutely critical boiling point where like now I have to make this decision where I'm going to go with one or the other, and that's just going to like change my life forever. Like I'm going to abandon one and only go with one other idea. No, I can kind of hold those things in tension over time. And so just speaking for me personally, I might live with tension for my entire life, and I might die not really having decided, which was the right answer. And I'm confident that someday at that point I will find out what the real answer was, that it wasn't absolutely important. Like this particular thing wasn't crucial. Like I don't have to have the answer, because not everything else about my entire being and who I am is dependent on that particular answer. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't maybe some questions, because that's what makes this whole topic of evolution so contentious and so difficult for some people, is that they feel like there are some really fundamental big issues, big why questions about like why the world is the way it is. I don't want to go into very specific things. But they feel like there's some really big tension issues. Like if I make this decision, this is going to take me down some path, right? That's going to greatly affect my entire future. If I take this other path, I'm going to have a whole different future. And I feel like I have to make that decision because this is like, I have to decide because there's so many other doctrines or so many other things that are dependent on this one idea. And for some people, I'll just throw one out there. For some people, that is like Adam and Eve, the reality of Adam and Eve as separately created human beings. For some people, that is like the big sticking point. They're like, I can accept all this other stuff, about evolution. But that's the one place where if I accept this, it's going to greatly affect my entire understanding, all right, of who I am and my relationship to other people and to a creator God or something like that, right? And so that becomes a really, really, really important one. But I would even point out that even there, that you don't have to make that decision on a particular day. That's something that you should think of yourself as a lifelong learner about, and you should be able to hold those things somewhat in tension with each other and say that this is something I know is important, but I'm going to let this percolate for a long time. And I only say that because I have 25 years of experience of allowing ideas to percolate and realizing that it was important that I didn't just have snap judgments, all right, about a lot of things in my life. You need to allow things to percolate over time. So also, it really is important that you differentiate, right? I think between scientific and religious explanations for things, right? You have to understand that science and religion, they are addressing different aspects of human understanding, right? Sometimes you think that you're asking the same question, but the two things you think are in tension are really, you're looking at possibly different sides of the same coin. And they're not actually in as much tension as you think, because the questions you're bringing to bear are not, they're not actually the same exact question, right? And religion can have a different answer to what seems like the same question, but you can think of it as you're looking at it from a different perspective, right? A different truth, multiple truths contained in the same thing. Sorry, I'm being kind of nebulous there, but I'm also slightly trying to avoid saying very specific things and giving specific examples, because I don't want to get dragged down into, well, you said this about that and what's your view on that. I'm trying to be more general. Right. Science seeks to explain the natural world through empirical evidence and the scientific method, whereas what is religion doing? It's a framework for exploring meaning, purpose, moral value. You might say, well, but doesn't evolution, isn't there evolutionary morals? And there's evolutionary biologists go, well, that's evolutionism. That's taking the science of evolution to understand biological diversity and expanding it to say, can I use it as a philosophy to understand lots of other things about the world and explain lots of other why questions? There are plenty of scientists, or really people outside of science, that co-opt evolutionary theory as a biological science and use it to try to explain lots of other things. And that's actually where a lot of the tension comes between evolutionary biology and, well, actually that's not evolutionary biology. Evolutionism as a philosophy, as an idea, as a broader idea, that's where much of the tension comes in between religion and science. Right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge there's distinct roles of science and religion, and that can help reconcile some of these different perspectives. Right? Another thing to consider is that from a religious perspective, right, a theistic perspective, let's put it that way, is accepting that God uses methods, right? We can't go into all the different ways that a creator God could interact in the world. Is he completely in control of every single little thing? Does he start things up and put things into place and lets them run? And so they kind of follow some kind of patterns, but he's not really in control. Different religions and even within Christianity, there's lots of strains of thought about God's sovereignty and control. And this is where you get different ways of interfacing evolution and scientific principles with religion. Because some people would say evolution is just God's method of creation, right? They embrace the idea that evolution can be seen as a mechanism by which God creates or unfolds creation. And so in that case, Genesis is simply a metaphorical description of what God's doing, because obviously God's not going to explain natural selection to a more primitive audience that wouldn't understand, and is actually not interested in the mechanism of how God made things. God's telling them why things are made and the purpose of creation. So so this perspective could view evolution as a natural process still, but it's either guided or sustained or just part of the unfolding of God's initial setup. So for some people, that creates this harmonious interaction between the integration of scientific understanding and religious beliefs. All right. Who knows how long I've talked about this. I mean, this might have been a half hour, which is way too long. As I said before, in a live class, I would only have 5 minutes to answer these questions. You imagine how limiting that must feel, to have 5 minutes. But I would just hit, a couple of those things as bullet points very quickly. And what I would typically do is I would just encourage students, if they wanted to explore anything that I've said further, I'm more than happy to talk to students outside of class about these things. The most important thing is that I think students should be allowed to ask questions. And I emphasize, of course, that the thing they're responsible for on exams and all that is, this is like, you need to understand the concept, just like in any other class. Here's the base of knowledge. Here's the things that are known in this particular field by the people that study this particular area from a scientific perspective. And you're responsible for knowing what those facts are and what that theory is. All right. But obviously that theory interacts a lot with your own personal lives and other things you've learned and other experiences you have. And so I think it's important for you to be challenged with that by each other. And I'm willing to talk about that, beyond the scope of the class. But this isn't something that, that I'm going to spend time talking about in class. We're just sort of sticking with, let's just say, we're sticking with the facts and just learning, what this theory is. But as I emphasized before, part of the reason for the Q&A sessions, especially my anonymous Q&A sessions, is to I don't want students to feel like, yeah, you say you're just doing the science, right? You're just giving us the facts. Like, here's just what, here's what the evidence is. But how do I know you're not cherry picking the evidence? How do I know you're not like spinning it in a certain way, or like not really telling me exactly, like not presenting the negative evidence to me. And maybe you're avoiding like the really hard questions, like, you don't really have answers for this. So you're just sticking to things you have answers for that make sense and sound really powerful. And so somebody who has a very skeptical perspective on evolutionary biology, I understand is going to be skeptical of whatever they're being taught. And so these sessions are meant to, they're not going to 100% alleviate that skepticism, but at least it gives a student a chance, it gives you a chance to ask that question and to see that you're being engaged with, right? To say like, okay, well, he can't completely avoid this. All right, he's got to address this in some way. You might not be happy with, like how I address it. But I hope it at least encourages you to open up your perspectives on things. All right, we got to move on. We still have several questions to go. Now, fortunately, most of these are kind of related to each other, so I can just say ditto for this one or other ones. Religion tends to be a heavy influence on what people study regarding evolution. Or maybe I might rephrase that. I think what they mean is it has a strong influence on what people believe about evolution. Right? There's no doubt about that. All right. Some religions, some strains of religion would have very strong feelings about evolutionary biology and evolution in general. I have friends who went or are currently going to schools that are taught very different information regarding evolution. There tends to be quite a bit of controversy on certain theories and ideas between science and religion. Many people struggle to figure out whether to believe what their religion taught them or science studies. It can be very confusing as to which one to believe because both have their own evidence proving as to why their theories and ideas are correct. How do people choose which theories and ideas to believe? Does one or the other have more evidence behind their theories and ideas proving theirs to be right and not the other? Is there a common ground on these theories and ideas that are formed by science versus those formed by religions so that people don't have to make that difficult choice which one to believe? Now, that's a lot of questions in a question. That's a whole lot of questions. Let me just start by saying this question reveals one of the big problems we're dealing with in society right now. And that is this idea that everybody has their own facts, right? And so one side presents theirs and they have all their good evidence for this. And somebody else tells me, and I listen to them and it's like, no, you're presenting really great evidence. Your idea sounds good. So how am I supposed to choose between the two? Because they both sound pretty good. If you go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky and you read all that information, you don't know much about evolutionary theory at all. You're going to be told a lot of things about evolutionary theory, right? You're going to be, evolutionists believe this, they believe this, they believe this, they say this, they say this, and here's a bunch of quotes, right, from evolutionary biologists. But here's all this other evidence that suggests the Earth is young and that organisms aren't related to one another by common ancestry. If you don't have any other knowledge, you could find it very persuasive, right? And then you might come to my class. You might be in this class. And then you read this textbook and you read about the mechanisms and how they function. And you read examples about how organisms have adapted to their environment and so forth. And you're like, but that's really compelling too. And you read that whole thing about whales, and which is much more than you'll hear from, say, creationists who usually present just a couple little snapshots or pieces of information about whales and explain them away. But now you've seen to much greater depth, the amount of evidence and the types of experiments that have been done. And so you get a whole different perspective there. And it's kind of like, okay, I've got this idea and I got this idea, and it feels like I've got two choices. How do I know which one's better? And this is what happens with lots of different things in society today, right? Where we're sort of thrown very, very strongly worded and phrased, like you have to believe this because of this. And you're thrown a whole bunch of evidence in one perspective versus another perspective. And it makes it seem like we have competing equal theories. And I just have to choose which pieces of evidence I want to use and which idea I want to go for. How do people choose which theories and ideas to believe? So that decision on which theories and ideas to believe, it's obviously really complex and it's a deeply personal one, right? It involves a bunch of factors. You've got your individual beliefs, you have your personal experiences, you've got your cultural influences around you, your family and friends, you've got the weight you're going to assign to the scientific evidence versus religious teachings, right? So everyone kind of has a different mixture of those, right? You have different perspectives and you're going to prioritize different sources of information and knowledge to form your beliefs, right? All that's just to say, hey, it's a complex world, right? And each one of you is subject to different factors. And so there's no simple solution to this, except there kind of is a simple solution to the scientific side of things, right? When it comes to scientific theories, and evolution is a scientific theory. All right. Well, evolution versus evolutionism, applying some findings of evolution and then trying to take that and apply it to sociology and to all kinds of other stuff, right? Such as evolution. And evolution, as we've been talking about here and in this class, is a scientific discipline. All right. It's a scientific theory. Right. And so what is that based on? What are scientific theories based on? Well, they're based on empirical evidence. All right. They're based on experimentation. They're based on the consensus of the scientific community that's built over doing many different experiments. Right. So scientific theories are being continually tested, right? They're being refined, they're being expanded, you got new evidence emerges. Right. So the strength of a scientific theory lies in the ability to explain natural phenomena. Right? And those explanations do what? They make hopefully accurate predictions. And they're going to be subject to future, scrutiny and empirical scrutiny. So when you ask well, how can I know? Well, how do you know that, organisms are made of cells, right? You have evidence that you can point to. So if it's a question about the physical makeup of the world and how the physical matter, the natural laws of this universe function, the scientific method is a really powerful method of knowing and making decisions about what is the best theory, right? Because you have a way of testing it. On the other hand, you've got religious beliefs. That's going to be based partly on what I guess you could nebulously call faith. You have revelation, which would be some kind of direct word from somebody. So you have revelation, which is maybe words from the past, all right, written down that represent edicts from God or from a higher being, right? Those are words that come to you as truth. It's kind of like, and you also have, your parents telling you stuff, right? And you trust them, all right? You can trust your religious leaders. You can trust your parents. You can trust your grandparents. They can give you advice, right? So they provide a framework for understanding, the meaning and purpose of life, moral values, relationship between humans and divine. So they carry, they vary, of course, among traditions and individuals. Now, I happen to be a religious person. And so I happen to believe in a particular form of revelation that I think is very important and weighs very heavily on some of my decisions and some of my beliefs, right? And some of who I am and my own understanding of the meaning and purpose of life. But I can also look at scientific theories and I can say, I might not like that scientific theory because maybe it conflicts with something that I think is the way, what I think has been revealed as the way the world has been made or should operates, right? Some truth about the world that this scientific theory seems to be incompatible with. I can, and here's what I would say in class, is I can say I can look at that scientific theory and I can say I don't like that scientific. I don't like the conclusion of that scientific theory because it makes me feel tense, right? It makes me feel like I have some conflict here. And I don't like conflict. I'm not a conflict person. I just want everyone to get along, right? And so I don't like that feeling. But that doesn't mean that I'm just going to sweep away the scientific theory because, if I can look at it and I can say, I can actually look at that evidence. It's one thing to say like, oh, your professor told you this and that's a theory and you just have to believe that. And there is a belief sort of aspect to that if you're unwilling to look at the evidence yourself. If you're unwilling to go and actually read the papers and like test those ideas for yourself, look at the evidence and say, does what they're saying make sense? Is this theory been developed in a way that really truly does follow the scientific method and comes to logical, proper conclusions? If you're willing to do that, and I look at it and say like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That does seem to be the best possible explanation for the evidence we have today. This is the best theory. I cannot think of a more economical, logical, and consistent way of explaining all of the observations I have in front of me. I can't think of a better theory, right? Now, I might still say, I don't think that theory is right because I weigh this other thing higher in my mind, all right? So for me, that's, personally, my beliefs and so forth, all right? I weigh this higher. But I also will not do this. I will not say to you, that theory is bunk, right? I don't like that particular theory, but I can present it as this is the best scientific explanation for this set of evidence, right? I can't deny that. And so that's partly what we're doing, and that's partly what you're doing is you're learning a whole large body of science, not just evolutionary biology. You're going to learn a lot of other stuff that comes into conflict with a lot of other ideas outside of science. And hopefully what you're going to learn, and hopefully what you're going to be taught in my class and other classes, is examining the evidence before us. What is the best explanation? What's the best evidence, natural explanation we can come up with to explain what we're observing? And so here it is. And if you choose to believe otherwise, you at least have to acknowledge that I don't have any evidence for what I believe, right? I can't necessarily logic you into my belief. I can't present to you, well, here's a whole nother body of science, of observations from the world that are better explained by my belief. Because if you're going to explain it with your belief and your belief is the scientific explanation, well then you got a better theory. But those other forms of beliefs and other forms of ideas and other things that we accept that are outside of science, you're not going to be able to explain with a better scientific theory, right? Because if you can explain with a better scientific theory, then you're explaining it in a naturalistic way. By definition, you're explaining it through naturalistic methods and means. All right, so once again, got to remind you, science and religion often have different aims, right? They have different methodologies. And so it's just always important to keep that in the back of your mind. There's a different aim, there's a different goal. Sometimes you're asking what sounds like the same question, but you're asking slightly different questions, and that's why the conflict exists too. All right, science is trying to explain the natural world through observations and testing. And religion is addressing, in many cases, ultimate meaning. So if religion is explaining ultimate meaning, purpose, and values, then you can offer sort of this complementary approach, right? Perspective, where different aspects of human existence are being explained in different ways. So finding common ground between science and religion, this is just a topic that's ongoing exploration and dialogue. You got to open yourself up to dialogue. You have to be willing to look at evidence. You have to be willing to, and I know it's kind of scary. You want to just have the answer, right? We live in a society where it's like, I just want black and white. I want to know, like, truth, this is a lie, this is true. But I think you got to be ready to hold yourself, like I said before, you got to be able to hold a little bit of tension there. You got to be able to say, these might be different perspectives on the same thing. Maybe that's why it's in tension. Maybe I need to examine both of them. I need to examine the science and understand it better. I need to understand my own, how I came to these convictions. What are my hermeneutical methods for interpreting scripture? What religious leaders do I trust? What is their background and how do they come to their conclusions? This could take years of study to really be able to examine their thoughts. Because if you haven't really delved into that on the religious side either, you can be easily swayed by some charlatan or somebody who may be well-meaning, but is saying you have to believe something that actually isn't true either. Just like in science, there are a million quacks out there, right? That are saying, that they're telling you this is what science says, or you have to believe this because I got this evidence for this or whatever. And they're a bunch of conspiracy theories, right? So you can be taken advantage of in the world of science, and you can be taken advantage of in the world of religion. And so that's another reason why you shouldn't just immediately think, okay, I know this here, and so I need to reject this over here. Be willing to weigh the evidence on both sides and be willing to hold that tension for a long time before you feel like you have to make a decision. Okay, next question, and we can see we're on the same theme. Out of all the questions by my students in this class in this first round of Q&A, a full 1/3 of them involved religion and science, the tension between religion and science. And so I think that tells you something about the world we live in, in terms of perceptions of this topic, because not all these students necessarily actually feel this tension themselves. They may just know that or think that there's tension because they've been told there's tension, and that's why they have questions about it. I'm sure some of them actually do feel that tension. But you combine those two and you can see that there's a lot of interest in this topic still. Right, here we go. Studying science and also being religious can be very controversial with certain theories and ideas, especially back in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries when different ideas regarding animal and human evolution started to arise. Everything people have been taught and what that current world knew was coming into question. Yes, we talked a lot through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century and talked about the huge new ideas that were coming about as this nascent scientific method. Well, actually not nascent at that point, but as the scientific method began to grow in terms of a way of approaching questions, how to answer questions about the world using that methodology. suddenly standard ideas about the world were being questioned. And so there was a massive amount of upheaval in thinking and rethinking ideas throughout this time. And today, people still have questions and concerns. So how can people study science and still preach the word of God written in the Bible? Do people pick or choose what they want to believe, or is there specific evidence that one theory is correct and the other one is wrong? The opinions on both sides are so strong, but is there mutual explanation with both sides comparing and evaluating each other's arguments to help people compromise with their scientific and religious beliefs? So, how much of what I've already said should I repeat? All right. The relationship between science and religion is really complex, right? And it varies between each individual and between each religious tradition. There really isn't any one size fits all on how people reconcile scientific theories, such as evolution and religious beliefs. So different approaches do exist. I think in the United States, we have this very dualistic sort of perception that there is like maybe fundamentalist Christians, and you either believe the Bible, you either believe the Bible as it's written in this literal way. And I hate that your word literal, but nonetheless, that's the word they would use. They're reading it in a literal way. And there's only one way to understand the scriptures. It teaches that the world is 6,000 years old and that God created all the different kinds of organisms separately, and there's no common ancestry, right? It's just to bundle it up into a short phrase. And then there's another view, and that other view is all life came from a common ancestor, and it can all be explained by purely naturalistic ways, and there is no God involved in any of that process. Right, and the world is extremely old. And so what that really boils down to is there is religious view, which is this: God made the world 6,000 years ago and all the individual organisms, or it's you don't believe in God and the world is old and everything happened by evolution. So it is a dichotomous viewpoint, and you have to pick your side. And what, of course, happens there is that that is a massive amount of tension, right? And that sounds like something you have to resolve right away. Like, are you an atheist or are you religious? And if you're going to be religious, then you've got to come into a class like this, and you have to be ready to close your ears and close your eyes and just sort of make it through. All right. Try to memorize everything. Don't try to understand anything, and get your grade out of here and just get out. Without hopefully hearing anything that makes you doubt what you think you know. Right, I'm being kind of facetious when I say that, but there are individuals that really feel that way. They really feel threatened. And I hope this class doesn't make you feel threatened. As I said before, I hope you feel like it's just important that I understand what it actually is, what it is that I don't believe in. That's actually an important thing to know. What is it that you don't believe in? And I'm confident that every single person that takes this class will realize that, oh, wait a second, I don't believe any of this stuff, right? There's some of it that I'm kind of okay with, especially if you're like a young earth creationist and you think that 2 dogs were on the ark and those 2 dogs became 35 different species of dogs through really rapid speciation over the last 4,000 years. Well, then chances are you do accept a whole bunch of evolution, right? A whole bunch of evolution. You are an evolutionist. You're just a hyper-evolutionist. You believe evolution at a super fast pace. But creationists believe that all those things happened, right? That all those species were formed in a relatively short period of time, and not by any supernatural means, by all naturalistic means, which means they believe they can explain it. They believe they have a scientific theory, a scientific explanation that is mostly evolutionary biology, but tweaked evolutionary biology, because they believe that mutations happen at different rates and natural selection can happen at different speeds and so forth, right? They change some of the rules of evolutionary biology, but they change them within a naturalistic context. In other words, they're not saying that God came in and like created a wolf and a coyote and like interfered in the way the world's operating and like, oh, I'm going to add this feature or do this or do that. They believe that it's an unfolding of a canine kind into other different kinds and forms that adapted to different places in this world. Like everything I'm describing there is, if you were brought up to believe that evolution is wrong, like the whole word evolution is wrong, but you believe in young earth creationism, well, you actually were probably going to be fine with 3/4 of all the material in this class. It's all going to be totally okay, right? It's not incompatible, that portion of the class. So at least right there, you can recognize that the divide is not kind of what it's said to be. But then the other aspect of this is that there are many, 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 many people who are religious, theistic in ways that hold a fair amount of compatibility with evolutionary biology and religious faith, that it isn't in complete contrast. And there are as many different ideas about how to resolve that tension as there probably are people who have thought about this topic. So don't feel like, you shouldn't feel like, I don't think anyone could point you to one like thing that like one person who like can explain it all for you. And I think that's the great thing about the world, really. I mean, it's like we're always learning. And the fact that we're always learning about everything, about all different kinds of aspects of life, not just explaining the physical aspects of the world through science. As we learn about ourselves and about life, we're always growing, and those kind of discussions about religion and science, I think make a person a much more full person, right? If they're able to discuss these things outside of just evil and good, right? I'm just picking one side and I'm sticking with it, and I'm going to ignore everything else. That doesn't lead to a very well-rounded person. You're just not going to be able to have discussions with people. You're just not going to be able to interact in any kind of rational way with people in the future. But I don't want to go on a rant on that. So let's move on to the next question. We got 3 questions left. One of them will be fairly short. I never put much thought into evolution. I took in the information I was told and applied it when I needed. Of course, reading it made sense to me. Seeing how animals and bugs changed and adapted to their environment over time, that makes sense to me. I think where I really drew the line was when it came to the evolution of humans. I think this is a common sentiment, okay? I think a lot of people, and I hear this a lot from, like, I'd say religious friends of mine, right? They're like, yeah, I'm okay with the evolution thing, but human beings. Right? It's like, that's all good. I kind of get that. That's okay. But that's where I draw the line. Basically saying we came from apes just never made sense to me. Like, I understand we're similar, but that gave someone the idea to think, but what gave someone the idea to think that we could have possibly evolved from them? As a Christian, now I started to hear more about how evolution was not real and that God created each animal and bug for a reason. At first, it didn't make sense to me because of everything I'd learned in the past. But then I got to thinking about, hey, maybe people are wrong about evolution. So my question would be, why is evolution so important now when people are coming out against it and even saying that it's not real? I mean, I understand people have evidence to back things up, but why do we really rely on it so much when there's so much misinformation out there? I think this is a great question. Now, I don't mean it's a great question because, how do I mean that? I think it's a good question because I think it represents the angst of a lot of young people about the world we live in today. And why do I say that? Because this last part here. I mean, I understand people have evidence to back things up. Now, of course, what they've suggested is, well, there's evidence to back up that God made each creature separately, and that here's evidence for why evolution is not real. I just visited a local creation museum here in the area. And if you didn't know anything about evolutionary biology, didn't really know science very well and you walked through that museum, you would come away with a very strong sense like, wow, there's all this evidence that the world is really young. There's all this evidence that everything is designed and nothing could have been made by any process. It had to have been made by a creator, right? An intelligent being, intelligent design. And those are very powerful arguments. And so then you have others who are saying, well, like, okay, here's all this evidence for evolution. So everybody has their own side, right? Everybody has their own evidence. So, but why do we rely on it so much when there's so much misinformation out there? All right, this is kind of confusing, but there's evidence on both sides, but then how do I try? Obviously, one side has to be wrong, so one side is presenting misinformation, and there's just so much misinformation out there. The last part of it pretty much just like this is where a lot of people are at. It's like, I don't even know what to believe anymore, right? We have alternative facts for everything. Everybody can make their own facts to fit whatever story they want. And after a while, you kind of get worn down, right? You just get worn down. You get worn down by people that are so insistent that something must be true, and they keep throwing more stuff at you. I mean, the whole, actually, I don't want to say the word because it's going to be on YouTube and then I'll get flagged. So this represents the angst. All right. I think of the younger generation today. They hear the alternative facts out there about everything, and everybody has an opinion, but they also say they have the evidence to back up their opinion. They're always throwing like, oh, this proves this, this proves this, this proves this. And pretty soon what you have is you have 10 different ideas out there, and everybody is totally insistent and sounds incredibly confident that they're right. And you are kind of left with like, well, how do I decide? How do I decide? And there's so many times we get burnt because we go down something that sounds good to our ears, sounds reasonable, and then later we find out, no, that was a bunch of bunk, right? That was all made up stuff. People are literally making up facts, right? It's not even just reinterpretation of facts. The facts even aren't the facts in today's world. And so everything seems to be misinformation. Now, I'm going to go back and say that this is one of the advantages of science. If you're a scientist and if you really understand science and you understand the scientific process, this is one way to escape this conundrum of misinformation. Right? It takes a lot of work, but you can test ideas. You can collect information. You can draw hypotheses and test them and weigh the evidence. And the scientific method gives you a way of saying, this idea, this hypothesis is better supported than this other one. At least it gives you some direction to go. Now, this question suggests like, okay, I started hearing one thing and this seemed reasonable to me, but then there's other days that don't feel reasonable to me. And then I started to hear about how evolution was not real, that God created all the animals and bugs each for a reason, right? So, I was told that evolution is not real. That's a really common thing to hear among some different groups of Christians, especially like young earth creationists. And so it can leave a person feeling very overwhelmed. I think you're taking a class like mine, and hopefully we're going to go somewhat in an organized fashion. We're going to go through a whole bunch of different areas of evolutionary biology and show what has been learned about all those different areas. And you might be quite convinced of some of those things, but there might be some other aspects of evolutionary biology you're not terribly, convinced by. And part of the reason you're not convinced is maybe because this is just a cursory look. I mean, to be honest, one semester is a very cursory look at evolutionary biology. And so we have to be very general in some cases. And so what you need to remember is you can't just say, well, I didn't understand that, or that wasn't convincing, so therefore it's not true. It's kind of incumbent upon you to explore further. So again, I go back to don't make rash decisions. Don't throw one thing out of the other. Also, if you have strong convictions that different parts of evolutionary theory are completely incompatible with my religious beliefs, I wouldn't come to you and say, okay, now here's the science, here's all this evidence, it's incompatible, therefore you need to change your mind. Right? No. In fact, I would say you should not change your mind based on just one presentation of the evidence. because I wouldn't want you to live your life like that. I wouldn't want you to be like, I just watched this YouTube, 2-hour video on X topic, right? And boy, that person was really convincing about, the best abs device in order to get rid of fat, right? If you're convinced by that, just based on one viewing, and then you're going to change your whole life and you're going to change your diet, well, you shouldn't jump to that conclusion that fast. I'm going to say the phrase, you should do your own homework, right? But of course, doing your own homework in the context of what I mean is not just looking at Twitter and Facebook and seeing what other people said about that YouTube video. It means actually going in the literature and seeing whether there is evidence to back up what they said, right? And that's the thing, as a biologist, because you're taking biology and you're going to learn a whole bunch of biology, hopefully you're going to have the tools when you're done with this to at least be able to assess the validity of biological questions about this world. All right. Ideas that involve things about the science of biology. You should be able to discern. This seems to be a well-supported idea. This is a less supported idea. And if this is a really well-supported idea, then that's an area where I need to consider, how does that jive with other things I've learned? And that's where you might then start to form certain types of tension that might take a long time to be resolved. But you also might resolve them very quickly by understanding that I just don't want to make a snap decision. I heard one thing, I heard one fact, and then I just changed my whole outlook on life because of that. No, don't do that, right? You heard me talking in this class, and you said after the class was done, which I've had many students tell me, it's like, I didn't know any of this stuff, and it was really fascinating. It was really interesting to see like the connections and just like how biology works. I really see how like all of biology is kind of connected through evolutionary theory, all population genetics and natural selection, all that stuff is really cool. And it really did make me think about things that I had never thought of before. And I was always told that like all this is just nonsense, and obviously it isn't nonsense. So now what do I do? And I don't say like, yes, you should just believe science, and if it's incompatible with anything else you believed before, you should just throw all that stuff out and just completely convert. All right? No, I wouldn't want you to do that. I don't want to be responsible for that. If in the long run you explore this further and you really deeply think about all of your different ideas and the different influences in your life, and you begin to shift some of your beliefs, all right, shift some of the explanations for really important questions about this world, right, and the purpose of this world. And in other words, you're balancing those things in a different way. Then that's fine. That's great. I think that everyone is growing in their understanding of themselves in this world by doing that. But it shouldn't be a process that just happens overnight. It shouldn't be a switch that's flipped, because it can be dangerous to move from one idea to another without any kind of reflection upon it over a long period of time. I titled this one, The Influence of Religion on Science. So once again, another similar question. And the first line is curious because it says, with the idea of religion being a heavy influence in what and how people studied. I just want to back up here. Religion tends to be a heavy influence on what people study regarding evolution. With the idea of religion being a heavy influence in what people studied. I'm a little suspicious of those two questions. They make me slightly suspicious of a potential for an artificial intelligence to have been used to help write these questions. Not certain. It could just be two people in the class that have been talking to each other. But the word heavy influence, the phrase heavy influence, it's just not a common phrase, I think, for students to use. So I just want to let you know, that just sent up a little warning bell in my mind. But the question is still a valid question. There were many different factors that went into the importance of discoveries that we have readily accessible to us today. This can be noticed heavily when you look into the example of the Great Flood? Do you think that if religious belief never played a factor in what people studied, that we would have gotten to the point where Darwin could have made or put the pieces together? Do religion and science play hand in hand when you break down the theories and how people got to the point of having such a revolutionary scientific breakthrough? I think I've kind of addressed all this mostly before. I just want to go back to this can be noticed heavily. Again, kind of weird use of the word heavily. When you look into the example of the Great Flood, so that would be like Noah's flood. And we had talked briefly about that's the origins of with Woodward in the late 1600s of when people started to realize the world is old, like more than 6,000 years old. Then people started wondering about like, well, what about the flood? What influence did that have? And when people started realizing that geology is like a series of layers and they have fossils in them, and how do you explain the fossils? And that's sort of where the whole flood geology thing came from, the idea that there was a worldwide flood. I mean, the idea existed, of course, that there was a worldwide flood before that, because that's from Genesis 8 and 9. And that was widely believed, that there was a global flood. But what was the nature of that flood? People didn't really think about what exactly did the global flood do, and how did it make mountains? And nobody knew what the origin of mountains and sedimentary layers were really before this time. So now you get to a point where people are wondering about these things, and then there's a suggestion like, oh, well, maybe all the fossils are just remnants of living things from before the flood that got swept up in the flood and then deposited. So that then is the beginning of changing from a kind of a static world to a really dynamic world, in which some people are now thinking the world is really, really old and dynamic over long periods of time. And then other people are looking at that same evidence and going like, well, we have to explain that evidence somehow. So they're taking that evidence and still trying to fit it into a biblical time frame or short time frame of 6,000 years. And so they put it into the flood. So do I think that if religious belief never played a factor in what people studied, that we would have gotten to the point where Darwin could have put the pieces of evolution together? Yeah, I mean, Darwin was influenced by a bunch of theists, and in a way he's reacting to a bunch of theists. And I will also say that, most everyone to this point who had made great discoveries in science were theists of some type, right? Had a variety of different religious viewpoints. Very few like true atheists to that point in history. And so everyone had an assumption of theism, that there is a God. But many thought that God is, well, like many people do today, that God is the author of the natural laws, and the world then is following those natural laws in terms of its progression over history and through time. And so we can use science to explain the physical changes in the world because the laws are consistent, over time. And the more we understood the laws, the more we can understand history. And that sort of drives sort of like these questions of geology and then eventually biology, because fossils suggest that there's different organisms in the past than there are in the present. So you have to have an explanation for that. Why are organisms different in the past than the present? Even creationists today have to grapple with that, right? Because 99% of all the things in the fossil record are extinct. They don't exist today. So why are the things in the fossil record different than what's alive today? And for creationists, they would say that there was a kind of canine that was on the ark, but it's different than wolves are today. And so things have evolved from the ark to today. And so there's hundreds of thousands of species, in fact, on Earth that have changed very much over time and have changed since the time of creation. So even if you believe that God created original types of organisms, they might not have looked anything really like exactly the species that are here today. And so if you'd stepped back in time, it would have been a very different time. Now, those who believe that the world is hundreds of millions of years old in terms of life, believe that all that change is spread out over a longer period of time and is probably more dramatic than what young Earth creationists do. But in fact, there is similarity in the sense that everybody believes that change has happened. That wouldn't have been believed, if you lived 1,000 years ago. And so those ideas are all out there already before Darwin. And so in some senses, yes, Darwin wouldn't think about how to explain the change in organisms over time. if others hadn't come before him to show that organisms had changed over time. Yeah, that there was abundant evidence that organisms were different in the past than they are in the present. So yes, everybody who made great discoveries is really kind of standing on the shoulders of people before them. They wouldn't necessarily have come up with that novel idea without any kind of preliminary evidence that was already causing people to ask the question. People were already asking in Darwin's day, how did organisms change? It kind of looked like organisms had changed. And so, but now there was a question about the mechanism. And Darwin kind of filled that gap. Here's a mechanism, natural selection, to explain how organisms could change. He wouldn't have done that if he had lived 1,000 years earlier, because he wouldn't even have been asking that question. And he really wouldn't have the resources to be able to answer it either, even if he did just ask that question to himself. But it would have been so foreign to the thinking of people in that day. So yeah, I mean, everything is contingent on everything else, right? We're all connected. And so Darwin is connected to all the different religious influences that were in Europe at the time. And he is interacting with those forces in his development of ideas. And there were many, many Christians who took his ideas and then, said these are compelling answers to some of the questions people have been asking. And then they sort of have tried to work to figure out how that fits with Scripture. So it's working both ways in many cases. All right. Yes. And we are to our last question. Finally, I'm scared to look to see how long I've been talking. I don't even want to know at this point. So this is going to take forever to edit. So we all know that the findings in this era that evolution exists and is either helpful or not for the survival of the species. How does the intersection of religious beliefs and evolutionary biology influence the perspectives and approaches on evolutionary biologists who hold religious convictions, and how does this dynamic impact the broader field of evolutionary biology? I'm talking about all the religions, mostly Islam, Judaism, Christianity. The intersection of religious beliefs and evolutionary biology presents an intriguing area of inquiry, particularly when considering the perspectives and approaches of evolutionary biologists who hold religious convictions. How do these scientists reconcile the religious beliefs with the scientific principles and findings of evolutionary biology? Does their religious worldview influence their research questions, methodologies, and interpretations of the data? Furthermore, how does this dynamic impact the broader field of evolutionary biology, including collaboration, scientific discourse, and public understanding of the science? Or can science be wrong about things in the future? Okay, I'm not even going to finish this. It's too much time I'm taking to read this question, because you can already see what I'm going to suggest about this question. I believe ChatGPT wrote this question. And so, disappointed in the class that somebody would use ChatGPT. I'm going to admit right up front that for this particular class, I have not written a guideline for my expectations of the use of artificial intelligence in this class. It would be very difficult to use artificial intelligence for any other aspect of this class other than this discussion forum. But obviously, artificial intelligence can write questions, right, for students. You can give it a prompt and ask it I need to ask a question in class about evolutionary biology. Could you suggest some? And I think this is one that was suggested. This is actually a whole bunch of questions, as you can see. You might be wondering, how do I know that it's ChatGPT? There's a couple things that are warning flags in this question. One is that it's way too articulate for most students. Now, we know that there are students who write really well. And if we ask ChatGPT whether it was written by ChatGPT, it'll say, yes, it believes that it probably was. And all it's doing is saying, yes, the grammar, the types of wording, the general types of words that it uses, and the style that it writes in. There are students who have learned to write in that style just naturally. And so that's why it's so hard to prove when that something is ChatGPT. But I've also highlighted in yellow. You see that word dynamic impact, and it's mentioned a couple different places. Also the word scientific discourse. That's a pretty unusual phrase, all right, for students to use. And so no one of these things is that's absolute proof that this was written by AI. But this line right here presents an intriguing, let me see, let me get my pen out here. I mean, you can see what I'm talking about, but presents an intriguing area of inquiry. When I read that phrase, I immediately thought ChatGPT. But I've used ChatGPT enough for a bunch of different inquiries to realize that this is a favorite phrase of ChatGPT. It loves to use this language. This is an intriguing area of inquiry. Like whatever you ask it about, like, could you tell me about blah, blah, blah? And it says, blah, 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 presents an interesting area of inquiry, particularly when considering the perspectives and approaches. Perspectives and approaches, those two, that clause, perspectives and approaches, I've seen it 100 times, right? That is a very common phrase that ChatGPT, the AI, loves to use. So all this together smacks very much of artificial intelligence. Now, so I'm not actually going to answer this question. Besides, I've already answered most of this question in other ways and other questions. As I was going to say, I was saying before, I don't have a policy about the use of AI. So I'm not going to actually do anything about this particular question. We're going to use it as a prompt and we're going to answer questions from this. What I would hope is that students don't use AI to respond to these questions, because AI can certainly do that. But AI tends to provide very generic answers. They might actually be good answers in the sense that they're reasonable answers that provide, I think, useful content. I know people say that ChatGPT throws out a bunch of garbage, and it does. But for really broad, big questions that have been asked by a lot of people over time and are concepts that are well understood in literature, ChatGPT does a great job of responding. But its responses are very not personal. And so the thing about this particular discussion forum is, as I've been saying multiple times, the whole purpose of the discussion forum is to allow students to engage and see the thoughts of other students and see different perspectives and see where other students are struggling with topics, to see other students' misconceptions, because a lot of their misconceptions are their own misconceptions. Oh, actually, I thought that way too. They don't want to admit it, but wow, this was a question I had. And now that I see the responses, I see like, oh, I wasn't really thinking of it that way. Because there are a ton of misconceptions in these questions. And so if you use ChatGPT to generate your responses, generally those responses they might be technically accurate in many cases, but they're not really got that sort of personal feel to them. And so it'll be pretty obvious to me in the responses whether somebody's using ChatGPT to write them. That won't necessarily be the case in the future, because I think that students and ChatGPT are going to get better at writing prompts and eliciting certain types of responses that get harder and harder and harder to tell are written simply by an artificial intelligence writing agent, or language module, I guess. All right, so I am finally gotten through the questions. How do I feel about them? I'm feeling kind of lukewarm about my effort. I know that I was overly wordy. I was repetitious, but that's just the way I always am. I feel like I was missing some probably pretty essential components of things that I normally say that I've just forgotten to say, especially in the questions about sort of the science and faith stuff. Those are hard for me to answer because, of course, I'm straddling this, I'm at a public institution. And, I think it's okay for me to give a personal perspective when asked a personal question. But I'm also cognizant that I'm not preaching a certain viewpoint to anybody. I'm trying to give students I'm trying to give students a set of perspectives. In many ways, I have a lot of personal views that I haven't shared with you. Right. I have some very specific personal views on some of these questions that if others outside this class were to listen to, they might think that I have they might get a misperception of what my particular views are because I'm being kind of generic, and I'm also representing the consensus view of, say, evolutionary biology on some of these topics. And that's not to say that I have like big disagreements with evolutionary biology, but I certainly have, I think I did mention, I do have certain tensions in my life with evolutionary biology and other convictions that I hold. But I think it might be helpful for you as students to understand that like not every evolutionary biologist is just some sort of outright, just an atheist who thinks that this is all that what we're talking about with evolutionary biology explains every single thing about our existence. So I feel like it's important to let you see that in my answers. And so this isn't the be all end all perfect answer to all these questions. It is a perspective. All right. I'm providing a perspective on ways to answer some of these questions. And I've also, in some of the questions that were more straightforward, I'm trying to also just sort of augment your understanding of the underlying principles that lie behind some of your questions. All right, so yeah, there it is. I seriously I'd be shocked if anyone's actually listening to me at this point. If you are, hey, thanks for hanging with me. Probably you just forwarded to the very end to see like what was my final word. So my final word is, hey, I kind of enjoyed this, although I'm kind of sweating. It's been a couple hours, and I do actually kind of feel like I do in class when I do my anonymous Q&A day. I come not knowing what the questions are, and I feel like I'm on the spot. And it's the day for the students to kind of like, let's see what he can do when he's not on script, right? When he hasn't prepared a lecture. What does he know, and how is he going to put this stuff together, and where is he going to mess up, and what kind of stupid things is he going to say? And I know that I've said some kind of dumb things along the way here. I am going to lightly edit this, so I'll probably find some things that I like, I shouldn't have said that, and I'll cut those out. So you won't see those things. But I'll try to keep as much authentic answer as I can when I do my editing. All right, that's it. This thing is way too long, so I had better stop now. Thanks for hanging out with me. And we'll do this again sometime. Thanks. Bye-bye.